Sterling Haverford raised his crystal glass and smiled at the most powerful criminal in Chicago. "Roman," he said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "I genuinely don't understand how you've gotten this far dragging that woman around with you." He tilted his glass toward Claire. "She's dead weight, brother. Always has been. Cut her loose before she drowns you." The table erupted. 12 men, financiers, fixers, men who had buried their mistakes in concrete, laughed like Sterling had just told the funniest joke of the evening. Roman Vexley laughed too. 1 second, maybe 2, then he looked at his wife. Claire wasn't crying. She wasn't flushed with embarrassment. She was completely still, the way a person goes still when something inside them quietly decides they have absorbed the last thing they will ever absorb from a particular room. Roman stopped laughing. If you've ever watched someone you love swallow humiliation in public and said nothing, if you've ever been that person, then you already know exactly what happened next inside that dining room. And if you've ever wondered what it costs a powerful man to walk away from the biggest deal of his life to defend the one person who believed in him before he was powerful at all, stay with me, because Claire Vexley had a secret that was about to change everything. Before we go further, if this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Every week we bring you stories about real human choices, loyalty, betrayal, and what people do when the stakes are everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. It genuinely helps more people find us. Now, let me tell you about Roman and Claire Vexley and the dinner that broke something open that could never be put back together the same way. Roman Vexley did not become the most feared man in Chicago by accident. He became it the way most men become dangerous things slowly, then all at once through a combination of intelligence, controlled fury, and an almost preternatural ability to read a room before anyone else in it understood what kind of room it was. By 41, he controlled logistics companies, luxury clubs, 3 construction firms, and a private security operation that the city's most connected people quietly relied on. His name appeared on none of the documents that mattered most. That was intentional. Roman had spent 20 years learning that the most powerful men in any organization were the ones nobody could directly prove existed at the center of it. The Vexley Syndicate, that was what other crews called it. Never Roman himself operated across 6 neighborhoods. Politicians returned his calls within the hour. Rival organizations maintained careful distance from his territory. Judges who had once been ambitious young men found it useful to remember that Roman Vexley had good memory and long patience. He was, by every measure available to the world that knew him, untouchable. The world that knew him didn't know Claire. She had been there 12 years earlier, when Roman Vexley was 29 years old, and his first legitimate business, a small freight distribution company he had built with borrowed money and 2 years of 18-hour days, was 90 days from collapse. The contracts had fallen through. The financing was gone. 3 of his original employees had already quit because they could read numbers. Roman had sat in their apartment kitchen at 2 in the morning, with the books spread across the table, and Claire had sat across from him with coffee she'd made because she couldn't sleep either, and she'd said nothing for a long time. Just let him sit inside the wreckage of something he'd built with his hands. Then she'd pushed an envelope across the table. "That's everything in my savings account," she said. "It's not enough to save the company, but it's enough to make payroll one more time so the people who stayed don't go home empty." Roman had looked at the envelope. He'd looked at her. "Claire, don't thank me," she said. "Just don't quit." He didn't quit. The company eventually collapsed anyway. Roman lost it 14 months later, but by then he had already pivoted, already found the next angle, already begun the work that would eventually become the Vexley Syndicate. And through every iteration of failure and reconstruction, Claire had been there. She had worked. She had gone without. She had treated the wounds he came home with. After nights, he never explained full, and she had never asked him to be something different from whatever he was becoming, because she understood that Roman needed to become it himself. What she asked, and what he had always provided until the night of Sterling Haverford's dinner, was one simple thing: respect. Not reverence, not performance, just the basic acknowledgement that she was a person in the room, not furniture. Sterling Haverford had never provided that. Sterling was 63, silver-haired, and carried the particular confidence of a man who had inherited enough money to spend his adult life deciding who deserved access to more. He was a crime financier in the cleanest possible sense. He never touched anything illegal with his own hands, but his capital flowed through investment vehicles that quietly supported operations exactly like Roman's. He was the man behind the money behind the men. His proposed alliance with Roman was, by any objective measurement, the kind of opportunity that came once in a career. Sterling controlled distribution networks across 7 states. If Roman's organization connected to those networks, the projection his accountants had run showed it would double, possibly triple his legitimate revenue within 4 years. The criminal revenue, never discussed in documents, would increase at similar rates. Roman had spent 3 months cultivating this dinner. He had worn the correct suit. He had brought the correct bottle. He had sat at Sterling's table with 12 of Sterling's closest associates and spent 2 hours being exactly the version of Roman Vexley that powerful men found comfortable, measured, impressive, slightly dangerous, in a way that felt controlled rather than threatening. He had brought Claire because Sterling specifically requested spouses. It was his tradition, he'd said. He liked to know the full picture of a man. Claire had worn a simple dark dress. She'd sat beside Roman, contributed to conversations when addressed, and done nothing at any point in the evening to suggest she was anything other than exactly what Sterling Haverford had already decided she was, the wife of a powerful man. Present, because she'd been invited, invisible, because that was the natural order of rooms like this one. Sterling had watched her all evening, not with interest, with the particular flatness of a man categorizing something as irrelevant. After the main course, when the conversation had turned loose and warm with expensive wine, and the sad section of men who believed they were about to make each other richer, Sterling raised his glass. Roman had assumed it was a toast, Roman, Sterling said, and he was smiling, and the smile had teeth in it that Roman should have noticed sooner. I genuinely don't understand how you've gotten this far dragging that woman around with you. The table went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then Sterling tilted his glass toward Claire. She's dead weight, brother. Always has been. Men like you need a partner who brings something to the table. Cut her loose before she drowns you. The laughter started at the far end of the table, where Sterling's 2 oldest associates sat. Men who had spent 30 years laughing at whatever Sterling found funny, because that was how you kept your seat at his table. It spread. The way laughter spreads in rooms where everyone is watching someone powerful and to understand how they're supposed to respond. Roman felt his face do something before his mind made a decision. He laughed. Not a real laugh. Not the laugh of a man who found something funny. The laugh of a man whose body had spent 20 years surviving rooms full of dangerous people by performing whatever expression kept the temperature calibrated. Instinct. 20 years of it. And for 2 seconds, instinct defeated everything else. Then Roman looked at Claire. She hadn't moved, hadn't flushed, hadn't reached for her wine glass or her napkin or any of the small props people grab when they need something to do with their hands. She was sitting perfectly straight, and her eyes had gone somewhere very quiet and very internal. The eyes go when a person is deciding something they won't announce out loud. Roman stopped laughing. He became aware with sudden and complete clarity that he had just laughed at his wife in a room full of men who believed she was nothing. He became aware that she had heard it. He set his glass down on the table. The sound was soft crystal on linen, but in the silence that followed, it landed like something much harder. Sterling, Roman said. Sterling was still smiling. Still expecting Roman to play along, because men like Roman always played along when Sterling was the one holding the money. That woman paid my rent when I had nothing, Roman said. She sat across a kitchen table at 2 a.m. and pushed her entire savings account at me because she didn't want my employees to go home without pay. She stayed in an apartment she could barely afford while I rebuilt from zero. 3 times. He looked directly at Sterling. She stayed when there was no Vexley syndicate. When there was no reputation. When there was no reputation. I'd survive long enough to build either. So, before you finish telling me what she's worth, I'd like to understand what you were doing during those same years. The laughter had stopped. Completely. The men who'd been laughing 20 seconds earlier were now studying their plates with the focused interest of people who very badly did not want to be noticed. Sterling's smile changed. Not gone. Recalibrated. The smile of a man who had just watched someone make an expensive mistake and was adjusting the price accordingly. Roman, he said, with the patience of a man explaining something to someone who didn't understand how money worked. This isn't personal. This is business. And in business, what a person contributed 10 years ago is not the same as what they bring today. Sentiment is fine. Sentiment is sweet. Sentiment costs you $40 million a year in opportunities you're too distracted to notice. Then I'll lose the 40 million, Roman said. He stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. Splitting. He did not do any of the things that Sterling's expression was quietly waiting for, because men like Sterling wanted Roman to behave like the criminal they privately believed he was, so they could dismiss whatever he said as the behavior of someone beneath them. Roman buttoned his jacket. "We're done here," he said. "Not because you insulted my wife. Because you insulted my wife and you expected me to sit still for it. That tells me everything I need to know about what this alliance would have looked like from the inside." He looked at Claire and extended his hand. She took it. They walked out of Sterling Haverford's private dining room together, and Roman didn't look back. And behind them he could hear the specific quality of silence that falls in a room when something irreversible has just happened, and no one is quite sure yet who it happened to. The elevator down to the lobby took 45 seconds. Neither of them spoke. The car was waiting black, armored Marcus behind the wheel, with the particular invisible quality Roman's best people had developed over years of understanding when to exist and when to disappear. He pulled into traffic without being asked. For 3 blocks, Roman and Claire sat in the back seat without speaking. Then Claire said, "You laughed." Roman didn't look away from the window. 2 seconds, he said. "I know how long it was." "Claire." "I'm not angry," she said, and her voice was measured in the way that told him she was angry, or something more complicated than anger that didn't have a clean name yet. "I know what those rooms are. I know what they require from you. I know that instinct is instinct." She paused. "But I heard it. I want you to know that I heard it. I know you heard it." Roman turned away from the window. "I saw your face. Then don't explain it to me. I don't need an explanation." "What do you need?" She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was doing something he'd spent 12 years learning to read, and tonight he couldn't entirely get there. There was the hurt, yes. That was present and clear. But beneath it was something else. Something that looked almost like a decision being quietly finalized in a room he didn't have access to. "I need to think," she said. Roman nodded. He reached across the seat and put his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. She also didn't turn her hand over to hold his back. Not immediately. And he had been married long enough to understand that the difference mattered. The car moved through Chicago's night-lit streets, and Roman sat with the particular quality of a man who has just walked away from $40 million and the most important alliance of his career, and knows he would do it again without hesitation, and is still not sure if that is enough. It was not enough. Not yet. What Roman did not know what he had never known. What no one outside of a small circle of lawyers and financial architects had ever known was that the woman sitting beside him with her hand quiet under his had spent 8 years building something. Hawthorne Dominion. The name was known in private equity circles, the way certain weapons are known by reputation and result, rarely by sight. A sound. A private investment conglomerate of unusual sophistication, whose ownership structure had been designed from the beginning to be opaque, whose founder had never appeared in public documentation, and whose capital had moved quietly through legitimate markets for the better part of a decade, acquiring, restructuring, and occasionally dismantling things that needed dismantling. Claire Vexley was its founder. She had built it during the years Roman believed she was managing modest investment accounts from their home office. She had built it carefully, methodically, and alone, not because she distrusted Roman, but because she understood with painful clarity what happened to things that entered Roman Vexley's orbit. They became his, not through cruelty or intent, but through the gravitational force of who he was. Rooms reorganized themselves around Roman, resources redirected toward him. Conversations shifted to accommodate him. Claire had watched it happen to people, to businesses, to opportunities for 12 years. She had built Hawthorne Dominion in the quiet space outside that gravity, because she needed to know she could. 8 years, 47 acquisitions, 12 restructurings, 3 strategic divestments, a portfolio that had grown in the last fictional that would have made Sterling Haverford's glass fall from his fingers if he'd seen the number. 3 months ago, Hawthorne had completed its largest acquisition to date. 58% of the legitimate corporate holdings supporting Sterling Haverford's investment empire. The woman's Sterling had called deadweight now controlled the mechanism that kept his entire legitimate operation breathing. Claire sat in the back of the car with her hand under her husband's and thought about timing. She thought about the document Warren Ellsworth had couriered to her office that morning, the one confirming the final transfer of controlling shares. She thought about the meeting Sterling was almost certainly already planning, the retaliation he was already designing, the levers he believed he controlled that he did not, in fact, control anymore. She thought about telling Roman, and she thought about all the reasons she hadn't told him yet, the architecture of justification she had built over 8 years that had seemed solid when constructed and now felt like something else entirely. She thought about the 2 seconds he had laughed. Outside the window, Chicago moved past them. The lake was out there somewhere in the dark, vast and indifferent, the way large things are when small human catastrophes are unfolding nearby. Roman was quiet beside her. He was not a man who handled silence badly. That was something she had always appreciated about him. He had never needed to fill space with noise. He could sit inside a difficult moment and let it be difficult, without rushing to resolve it before it was ready. She looked at the side of his face. In the early years, she had been terrified for him constantly. Samun, the nights he came home with his jacket torn, or blood on his collar that he'd tried to blot out before he walked through the door, or that particular controlled stillness that meant something had happened that he was never going to tell her about. She had learned not to ask certain questions. She had learned to treat the wounds he brought to her and to accept that the full story was not available and perhaps should not be. She had also learned that the man she married was, beneath everything he had become, still capable of the gesture he had just made in that dining room. He had walked away from $40 million because someone humiliated her. She had not expected it. That shamed her a little. She should have expected it. The car slid to a stop in front of their building. Marcus had the door open before either of them moved. Roman got out first and turned back to offer her, his hand the same gesture he'd made in the dining room, extending his hand to take her out of there, and Claire took it, and they walked through the lobby together without speaking. In the elevator, Roman looked straight ahead. "I'm going to lose the alliance," he said. "Yes. Sterling will move against us. He doesn't accept rejection." "I know. It'll get complicated." Claire looked at the elevator doors. "Roman," she said carefully, "I think you should be prepared for things to get significantly more complicated than you're currently imagining." He turned to look at her. Her expression was still doing that thing he couldn't entirely read. "What does that mean?" he asked. The elevator reached their floor. The doors opened. Claire stepped out. "It means," she said, "that there are some things I've needed to tell you for a while. And I think Monday is probably going to force us the issue." Roman followed her into the hallway. Claire, she had her keys in her hand. She stopped at their door and turned to face him. In the hallway light, she looked exactly like the woman he had married, and also like someone else entirely. Someone who had been standing beside him for 12 years, containing something enormous, and was now deciding whether she was finally ready to put it down. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight you did the right thing. Just let that be enough for one night." She went inside. Roman stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he followed her in. He did not sleep well. He lay beside her in the dark and turned the word Monday over and over in his mind. In his experience, when the people closest to you warned you to prepare for something more complicated than you were currently imagining, they were rarely wrong. And they were rarely delivering good news. He had been married to Claire Vexley for 12 years. He trusted her completely. He also understood, lying in the dark, that trust and knowledge were not the same thing, and that the woman who had sat quietly through a dinner where powerful men laughed at her and walked out of it with her face still composed and her voice still measured had been carrying something for a long time. He just didn't know what it was yet. Monday, he thought. Monday, he closed his eyes. Sleep, when it came, was thin and restless, and just before it finally took him under, Roman Vexley had the particular feeling, the one he'd learned over 20 years never to ignore, that the ground beneath him was about to shift in a direction he hadn't anticipated. He was right. He just didn't know yet how far it would shift, or how long the fall would take, or what he would find when he finally landed at the bottom of the truth his wife had been keeping from him for 8 years. Monday was 3 days away. It felt much closer than that. Roman spent Saturday doing what he always did when something was wrong and he couldn't fix it yet. He worked. He was in his home office by 6 in the morning, going through the quarterly reports from the construction division, marking figures that didn't align with projections, making calls to 2 of his operations managers who had learned years ago that Roman Vexley's Saturday morning calls were not optional and not brief. A sound. He moved through the work with the focused efficiency of a man who had trained himself to compartmentalize, because compartmentalization was the only thing that had kept him functional through the years, when everything around him was simultaneously on fire. Claire slept until 8. He heard her moving through the kitchen. The coffee maker. The particular sound of her opening the refrigerator and standing in front of it for a long moment, the way she did when she wasn't actually hungry but needed something to do with her hands. She didn't come to his office. He didn't go to the kitchen. This was not normal. In 12 years of marriage, they had developed the particular language of shared space, the checking in, the small acknowledgments, the cup of coffee left on his desk without a word, the hand on his shoulder as she passed. The absence of it was its own communication. Roman finished his calls by 10 and sat in the quiet of his office and understood that the distance between Saturday morning and Monday was going to be the longest 48 hours he had experienced in recent memory. He found her in the living room with a book she wasn't reading. He could tell because she'd been on the same page for 20 minutes. He'd been watching the clock. "I owe you more than an apology," he said from the doorway. Claire looked up from the page she hadn't been reading. "Roman, let me finish." He came into the room and sat across from her, not beside her, because this required eye contact and the particular formality of 2 people who needed to actually see each other. "I know what those dinners cost you. I know you go into them and you perform the version of yourself that those rooms expect. The quiet one, the background one. And you do it because you understand what I need from those situations, and you've always been willing to give it. I've taken that for granted." Claire set the book down on her knee. "I have always been willing to do that," she said carefully, "because I understood why it was necessary. What I was not willing to do was absorb public humiliation while the man I married laughed at the joke. I know. 2 seconds is still 2 seconds, Roman. I know that too." She looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing the thing again, the controlled surface over something much more complicated running underneath. And Roman had the particular frustration of a man who was excellent at reading rooms full of dangerous people and considerably less excellent at reading his own wife when she decided not to be read. "Do you accept the apology?" he asked. "I'm thinking about it," she said. It was the most honest answer she could have given him, and they both understood that. He nodded and left her to the book she wasn't reading and went back to his office and returned to the quarterly reports with the grim focus of a man burning time until Monday arrived and told him what came next. Sunday passed in a similar register. Polite, careful. The particular brittleness of 2 people who loved each other and were temporarily unable to reach across whatever had opened between them without risking making it worse. They had dinner at the kitchen table. They talked about things that were not the dinner. Claire mentioned that the plumber needed to come about the bathroom fixture. Roman mentioned that Marcus had a family situation and might need a week. Neither of them mentioned Sterling Haverford, or the Alliance, or Monday. Before she went to bed, Claire stopped in the hallway outside his office. "I accepted the apology," she said. Roman looked up from his desk. Earlier, she said, while I was thinking about it. I should have told you sooner. Thank you. She started to go. Then she stopped again, one hand on the doorframe, not looking at him. Whatever happens Monday, she said, I need you to remember that everything I have ever done was because I was trying to protect something real, not because I was trying to deceive you. Roman put his pen down. Claire, what is Monday? She turned and looked at him. Monday is the day you find out who I actually am, she said, and I need you to love me through it. She went to bed. Roman sat at his desk for another 2 hours and did not touch the quarterly reports again. Monday arrived the way difficult things always arrive, unremarkably, with gray light and the smell of coffee and the ordinary machinery of a morning that had no idea what it was carrying. Roman was in his car by 7:30. His phone had already delivered the first piece of information. Sterling Haverford had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors of Meridian Capital Partners, the largest legitimate corporate entity connected to their proposed alliance. The meeting was at 10. Roman was not on the guest list, which told him exactly what kind of meeting it was. He called his attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had navigated the intersection of Roman's legitimate and less legitimate interests for 11 years, and told him to attend as a representative of Vexley Holdings. Gerald said he'd be there. Roman's second call was to his head of operations, a man named Decker, whose function in the Vexley syndicate was to know everything before Roman needed to ask. Decker confirmed that Sterling had spent the weekend in 3 private meetings with 2 of his oldest financial associates and a man whose name appeared in none of the relevant documents, but whose access to certain regulatory channels was well understood. Sterling was moving fast. Roman expected that. What he did not expect was what happened at 9:47, when Marcus pulled up in front of the Meridian Capitol building, and Roman stepped out onto the sidewalk and found Claire already there. She was standing outside the entrance in a white suit, not the understated presence she'd performed on Friday night, but a version of herself he had never seen in a professional context. Precise, contained, and carrying the particular quality of someone who had been waiting for this moment long enough to stop being nervous about it. Beside her stood a man Roman recognized as Warren Ellsworth, one of the most respected private capital attorneys in Chicago. Roman had encountered him professionally twice before, always across tables from deals Roman was not involved in. A kind of attorney you hired when the transaction was large enough to require someone whose entire professional existence was dedicated to making sure the paperwork was an impenetrable fortress. Roman looked at Claire. Then he looked at Warren Ellsworth. Then he looked at Claire again. "What is this?" he said. "Come inside," Claire said. "I'll explain everything in the room." "Explain it now." Roman. Her voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed this enough times to have moved past the shaking part. "There are things I should have told you years ago, and I didn't. I know that. But right now, Sterling is upstairs preparing to do something to you in that boardroom that he has been planning for 9 months. And if we don't walk in there together in the next 8 minutes, he gets to do it uncontested." Roman's jaw tightened. "Claire, 8 minutes," she said. "Please." He looked at Warren Ellsworth, who had the professional composure of a man paid specifically to remain unreadable in moments exactly like this one. Roman straightened his jacket. 8 minutes, he said. The elevator was mirrored, and Roman watched his own reflection for 14 floors without speaking. Claire stood beside him, with the documents. Warren was carrying reflected in silver behind her, and Roman thought about Sunday night in the hallway, the way she'd looked at him, with something that was almost apology and almost something else. Something that was almost a request for the particular kind of grace that gets tested when someone tells you they've been keeping a room in the house locked for 8 years. They walked into the boardroom at 9:58. Sterling Haverford was already seated at the head of the table. He registered Roman's presence with the controlled expression of a man recalibrating a plan that had just encountered an unexpected variable. He registered Claire's presence with something closer to amusement. He registered Warren Ellsworth with a flicker of something he suppressed immediately, but not quite fast enough. "Roman," Sterling said, "this is a closed meeting." "I received word it concerned my business interests," Roman said. and took a seat without being invited to. Claire sat beside him. Warren placed his briefcase on the table. Sterling's attorney, a woman named Patricia Venn, who had a reputation for controlled ferocity in exactly these situations, leaned forward. Mr. Vexley, you're not on the agenda for this meeting. I'd suggest. Mr. Warren said, opening his briefcase with the unhurried ease of a man who knew precisely what was inside it and precisely what it was worth. My client would like to take a moment before we begin. The meeting's listed agenda to clarify some matters of ownership that appear to have been overlooked in your documentation. Sterling's eyes moved to Claire. His expression did something complicated. Your client, he said. Yes. Warren placed a document on the table and slid it toward Sterling's attorney with the practiced ease of a man who had been making this gesture in various forms for 30 years. Claire Vexley, founder and controlling owner of Hawthorne Dominion, private investment conglomerate, whose most recent acquisition, completed and transferred 3 weeks ago, represents 58% of the legitimate corporate holdings currently supporting Meridian Capital Partners. The room was quiet. Sterling did not move. Then he looked at Claire with an expression that had lost, entirely, the amusement it had carried 30 seconds earlier. Roman had gone completely still. He understood what he had just heard. His brain processed it with the speed of a man who had spent 20 years performing rapid threat assessment in rooms where the calculation of what someone else controlled was often the difference between surviving the room and not. He processed it and understood it and sat with the particular quality of a man whose world has just reorganized around a fact he did not previously possess. His wife owned Hawthorne Dominion. His wife had founded Hawthorne Dominion. His wife, who he believed had been managing modest investment portfolios from their home office, was the controlling owner of the private capital firm that had just acquired 58% of Sterling Haverford's corporate empire. Roman sat very still and looked at the document Warren had placed on the table. Then he looked at Claire. She was watching him. Not Sterling, not Warren, not the rest of the room. Roman, watching for the things she'd asked him on Sunday night to be capable of. The grace required when someone shows you a locked room and asks you to love them through what's inside it. Roman looked back at the document. Sterling had recovered enough to speak, which was, Roman acknowledged internally, a mark of genuine resilience. Lesser men would have needed another 30 seconds. This is a transparent maneuver, Sterling said, addressing the table rather than any individual. Roman Vexley is attempting to use his wife's corporate holdings to protect himself from the consequences of his own financial misconduct. Which brings us, conveniently, to the actual purpose of this meeting. He nodded at Patricia Venn. She opened her own documents. Mr. Vexley, she said, we have in our possession financial approval records from 7 transactions conducted over a period of 18 months, each bearing your signature, each connected to a pattern of losses totaling approximately $14 million in unexplained capital movements across entity connected to the proposed Meridian-Vexley alliance. These documents have been prepared for submission to the relevant regulatory bodies, unless what? Roman said. Patricia paused. Unless a mutual resolution can be reached regarding the Hawthorne acquisition, Sterling said. Specifically, a divestment of any controlling interest in Meridian-connected entities. The translation was clean and immediate. Give back what Claire had taken, or Roman goes down for $14 million in transactions he apparently signed off on. Roman looked at the documents Patricia had placed in front of him. His signature was on every page. He recognized 3 of the approval forms immediately. He had signed those. He had signed them without examining the attached financial schedules in detail because they had come through Gerald's office during a period when Roman had been managing a significant operational crisis in the construction division, and his attention had been divided. He had signed them because the covering documents presented them as routine approvals. He did not recognize the financial schedules attached to them now. Something cold moved through Roman's chest, not fear. Something more specific than fear. The feeling of a man who has just identified the shape of a trap and is simultaneously calculating how long it has been baited and how deep the drop beneath it goes. Roman, Claire said quietly beside him. He put his hand on the table between them, palm down, a gesture she knew. Not reaching for her, steadying himself. He looked at Sterling. "I'd like an independent review of those documents," Roman said. "Before anything else happens in this room." Sterling smiled. "Of course you would. That's not a concession," Roman said. "That's a requirement. If my signature is on documents connected to $14 million in losses, then either I approved what I thought I was approving, and someone changed the documents afterward, or I'm guilty of exactly what you're suggesting. An independent forensic review will establish which." Roman, his own attorney Gerald said from 2 seats down, in the voice of a man who was trying very hard not to broadcast alarm. "Perhaps we should—" "I want the review," Roman said, immediately, "and I want Claire's acquisition of the Meridian entities to remain fully in force until that review is complete." Sterling's smile had not moved. "You understand," Sterling said, "that requesting a review rather than simply resolving this quietly suggests a remarkable amount of confidence for a man in your position." "I'm requesting it because I'm confident," Roman said. "Or I'm requesting it because I'm guilty and genuinely stupid. You'll find out which." He gathered the documents in front of him and looked at Warren Ellsworth. "Can Hawthorne's legal team support an independent forensic document review?" Warren glanced at Claire, who nodded. "Yes," Warren said. "Then that's what happens next." Roman pushed back from the table. "We're done here until the review is complete." Sterling let them reach the door. Then he said, "Roman." Roman stopped but didn't turn. "The review will take weeks," Sterling said. "During that time, you understand that both your name and your wife's acquisition will be under active scrutiny. The press response to a federal financial investigation involving the Vexley name will be—" "I know what it will be," Roman said. He left. Claire and Warren were beside him in the elevator. The doors closed. Roman stood with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the floor numbers descending, and did not speak until they reached the lobby. In the lobby, he stopped. "Warren," he said, "give us a minute." Warren moved discreetly toward the entrance. Roman turned to Claire. She was watching him with the careful expression of a woman waiting to find out what kind of storm was coming. "Hawthorne Dominion," Roman said. "Yes, 8 years. Yes, you built it." Yes, his jaw was tight. His voice was controlled. The control was doing real work. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire held his eyes. "Because everything that enters your orbit becomes yours. Not because you take it, because the world reorganizes itself around you, and you can't stop it, and I can't stop it. And I needed something that was mine. Something I built with my own hands that wasn't connected to your name, or your reputation, or your world. So you hid it. I kept it separate for 8 years. Yes." Roman looked at her. "The document Sterling just showed me," he said. "My signatures are real, but I need you to understand that I did not approve $14 million in losses. Whatever those financial schedules say now is not what they said when I signed them." Something changed in Claire's expression. The careful watchfulness cracked slightly, and beneath it was something that looked like relief and something that looked like a new and very specific kind of anger that was not directed at Roman. "You're sure," she said. "I recognize 3 of those forms. I do not recognize what was attached to them." Claire was quiet for 4 seconds. "Then Sterling has been preparing this for a long time," she said. 9 months, Roman said. "At minimum." They stood in the lobby of the Meridian Capitol building and looked at each other. "He planned to use you as a scapegoat," Claire said. "If anything went wrong with the alliance. If regulators started looking at the Capitol movements. If any of the losses surfaced publicly." "Yes." Roman's voice was very flat. "He spent 3 months building a relationship with me. He spent 9 months building the exit route." Claire's hands had gone very still at her sides. "Roman," she said. "I was going to say." "I know what you were going to say." "Don't." She read him well enough to stop. What he was feeling was not something he was prepared to manage in the lobby of a building with cameras and foot traffic, and Warren Ellsworth's discreet back visible 30 feet away. What he was feeling required a room without witnesses, and probably several minutes that he was not going to give it right now. "The forensic review," he said. "How long?" Warren thinks. 3 weeks. Possibly 4. During those 4 weeks, I need to be separated from every business entity connected to Hawthorne's review, Roman said. Not because I'm guilty, because the appearance of separation protects the integrity of the findings. Claire nodded. Then she said carefully, I'm going to need to remove your operational authority from the 3 Meridian-adjacent entities in the interim. Roman stared at her. Temporarily, she said. Warren's legal opinion is that you're asking me to step back from my own operations. The operations whose documents carry your signature in a forensic investigation, yes. Her voice was very even. Very controlled. The voice of a woman who had thought through this part and knew it was the right call, and also knew it was going to land exactly as hard as it was landing. Roman, if you maintain active authority while the review is happening, Sterling's attorneys will argue the investigation is compromised. You know that. Roman looked at the lobby ceiling for one moment. Then he looked at his wife. You're also removing him, he said. Sterling, from operational authority. His removal from Meridian-connected entities was completed this morning before this meeting, Claire said. Warren filed the paperwork at 8:45. Roman processed that. You stripped us both, he said. I'd stripped the man who built a 9-month trap designed to destroy you, and I asked the man I married to step back temporarily to protect himself. Those are not the same thing. Roman was quiet. The lobby moved around them. People entering, exiting, the ordinary Thursday morning business of a building full of people who had no idea what was happening in their periphery. Claire, Roman said. I know, she said, when this is over. I know, she said again. We're going to have the conversation we should have had 8 years ago, and it's going to be hard, and I'm ready for it. But right now, I need you to let Warren do his job, and I need you to trust me. Roman looked at her for a long moment. I trusted you before I knew who you were, he said. I know. That hasn't changed. Claire let out a breath she had been holding, it seemed, for quite some time. Good, she said. It was not good, exactly. It was real, which was different and harder, and the only version of good that actually held up under pressure. Roman knew that. Claire knew that. They had both been in enough rooms where easy resolutions collapsed on contact with reality to understand that what they were holding right now was not resolution at all. It was a decision to remain standing next to each other while the ground continued to shift. That was, under the circumstances, the most either of them could honestly offer. Warren came back from the entrance with his briefcase and his professional composure and the expression of a man ready to begin the part of this situation he had been hired to handle. Roman straightened his jacket. One more thing, he said to Claire very quietly. Sterling has been preparing this for 9 months. He wasn't preparing it alone, Claire went still. Someone inside your operations fed him the access he needed to modify those documents, Roman said. Someone who knew which approvals I was signing without reading the full schedules. Someone who knew my habits well enough to exploit them. The implication sat between them. You think there's someone inside Hawthorne, Claire said. I think there's someone somewhere who's been watching both of us, closely enough to build a 9-month case, Roman said. And I think finding them is the most important thing that happens in the next 4 weeks. Before the forensic review concludes. Before Sterling's attorneys get any further. Before whoever it is decides the situation changed enough to warrant disappearing. Claire looked at him. The controlled surface of her expression had shifted into something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. Find them, she said. It was not a request, and they both knew it. Roman nodded. He walked out of the building into the gray Chicago morning with Marcus waiting at the curb, and he got into the back of the car and sat in the silence of a man who had just lost operational control of 3 of his businesses, discovered his wife was a billionaire, identified the shape of a trap that had been baiting itself for 9 months, and concluded that somewhere in the architecture of everything he thought he controlled, someone was still pulling a string he hadn't located yet. The car pulled into traffic. Roman took out his phone. He did not call Decker immediately. He sat for 30 seconds and let himself feel the full weight of the morning, the boardroom. Claire's face in the elevator, the documents with his signatures on financial schedules he had never seen, the 9 months of careful construction that Sterling had laid beneath the alliance like a sensation designed to collapse in a specific direction. Then he called Decker. I need you to find out who has been inside our document approval process for the last 12 months, Roman said. Anyone with access to signed approvals before they were filed. Anyone who could have modified attachments after the fact. I need names. Decker was quiet for exactly 1 second. The silence of a man recalibrating from whatever he'd expected this call to be about. How fast? Decker asked. Yesterday, Roman said. He ended the call. Outside, Chicago moved past in the gray morning light, indifferent as ever, and somewhere in the city, Sterling Haverford was sitting in a boardroom, calculating his next move. And somewhere in the infrastructure of Roman's own operation, a person Roman had trusted was carrying information they had agreed to carry for the wrong side. Roman looked out the window. The trap had been 9 months in the making. He had 4 weeks to dismantle it before it closed around him completely. And now, for the first time in his life, the most dangerous game he had ever played was also the one where he could not use the tools that had made him dangerous in the first place. Decker called back in 11 hours. Roman was in his home office when the phone rang, the room lit by a single desk lamp and the glow of 3 monitors he'd been staring at since 7 in the evening. It's going through every document approval log his operations manager had been able to pull, without triggering the kind of internal alerts that would tell the wrong person someone was looking. It was close to midnight. He'd eaten something. At some point, Claire had left a plate outside the office door, with the particular quiet of a woman who understood that her husband was in a place she couldn't follow right now, and was providing what she could from the threshold. He picked up on the first ring. Talk, Roman said. Decker's voice was flat in the way it got, when the information was bad enough that he'd already processed his own reaction to it and arrived at the functional side. I have a name, he said. You're not going to like it. I haven't liked anything in 4 days. Give me the name. A pause. Not hesitation, Decker didn't hesitate. A pause that was something else. The pause of a man who understood that what he was about to say would change the temperature of the room it landed in by a significant and irreversible amount. Philip Marsh, Decker said. Roman went very still. Philip Marsh had been Roman's document processing coordinator for 6 years. He was 34, quiet, meticulous, and possessed of the particular institutional invisibility that made him extraordinarily good at his job. He was the man who received Roman's signed approvals and routed them into the correct filing systems. He was the man with access to every document in the window between Roman's signature and the final archived version. He was also the man Roman had personally promoted 2 years earlier because his accuracy rate was perfect. You're certain, Roman said. Access logs don't lie, Decker said. Marsh opened 7 separate approval files in the 48 to 72-hour window after Romans signed them. Each time the file was accessed from his workstation during off hours. 2 of them were accessed at 2 in the morning. The metadata on the financial schedule attachments in 3 of those files shows modification dates that postdate Roman's signature by an average of 60 hours. Roman did the math without trying. 60 hours was long enough to look like normal processing lag, short enough to be invisible in a routine audit. He modified the financial schedules after I signed the cover documents, Roman said. Replaced them entirely. The originals are gone from the active system. I found fragments in a deleted partition that our IT guy had to go 3 layers deep to locate. Decker paused again. Whoever coached Marsh knew exactly how deep a standard forensic review would go. The fragments were preserved just far enough below the surface to survive a deletion, but deep enough to require someone who knew to look for them. Sterling knew what a standard review would find, Roman said. Because Sterling has done this before. That's my read. Roman sat with it for a moment. The full architecture of it. Sterling spending 9 months positioning Roman as the ideal scapegoat. Sterling finding Philip Marsh, or turning Philip Marsh, which was a different and more disturbing calculation, and using him to surgically modify the documents that would make the case airtight. Sterling building the trap with the particular patience of a man who understood that the most effective traps are the ones that look, from the inside, exactly like an opportunity. Where is Marsh now? Roman asked. That's the second thing, Decker said. He didn't come in today. His building manager says he cleared his apartment over the weekend. Paid the remainder of his lease in cash. Left, no forwarding address. Roman closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Marsh was gone. The man who had physically modified the documents, whose access logs were the forensic evidence that would prove the tampering had happened, was gone. Someone had told him to run. And the only person who would have told Marsh to run was the person who had turned him in the first place. Sterling moved him, Roman said. Before the forensic review even started, Decker said. Before the Monday meeting. Marsh cleared out Saturday. 2 days after the dinner. 1 day after Roman had walked out of Sterling's proposed alliance. Sterling hadn't waited to see what Roman would do. He had activated the contingency the moment Roman refused him, because the contingency had always been the plan. Decker, Roman said. Yeah, the fragments in the deleted partition. Can they be recovered well enough to establish what the original financial schedules said? Partially, enough to show the documents were modified. Not necessarily enough to reconstruct the originals in full. Is enough to show modification, sufficient for Warren Ellsworth's forensic review. A pause while Decker thought through it. It's enough to raise serious doubt about the authenticity of the current versions. Whether it's enough to definitively clear you depends on what else the review turns up. Roman opened his eyes and looked at the monitors. Find Marsh, he said. I don't care what it takes or what it costs. Marsh is the only person who can testify to what those documents said before he changed them. Without his testimony, the fragments are strong, but not airtight. I'll start tonight, Decker said. One more thing. Roman's voice had gone to a register. He rarely used not loud, not threatening, just very, very quiet, the way certain dangerous things are quiet before they're not. When you find him, you call me first. You don't move on him. You don't contact him, you call me. Another pause. Longer this time. Roman, Decker said carefully, what are you going to do when I find him? I'm going to talk to him, Roman said. He ended the call. He sat in the dark of his office for a long time. The lamp threw a small circle of light on his desk. Outside the windows, Chicago was doing what it always did at midnight, moving, never stopping, the particular restless insomnia of a city that had been built by people who didn't know how to be still. Then he went to find Claire. She was in bed but not asleep. He could tell from the quality of her stillness. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned the lamp on without being asked, because she knew him well enough to understand that this was not a conversation that happened in the dark. They found who modified the documents, Roman said. Claire sat up. He told her about Philip Marsh, the access logs, the timing, the deleted partition. He told her methodically, in the order the information had arrived, because that was how he processed things that were too large and too complicated to carry all at once in sequence, in the order they came, so that each piece could be understood before the next one arrived. Claire listened without interrupting. This was something he had always valued about her. Her capacity to receive difficult information without immediately trying to reshape it into something more manageable. She let it be what it was. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He's gone, she said, as of Saturday. Sterling moved him before the meeting Monday. Yes, that means Sterling wasn't improvising Monday morning, Claire said. Everything in that boardroom, the documents, the regulatory threat, the offer to settle quietly, that was all prepared in advance. He already knew the review was coming. He already knew Marsh would need to be moved. He knew, because the moment I walked out of that dinner, Friday night, he activated everything he'd been building for 9 months, Roman said. He'd been planning for my refusal as thoroughly as he'd been planning for my cooperation. Claire looked at the lamp on her nightstand, the small ordinary light of it. Then she said, he knew you might refuse him. He knew I was the kind of man who might. He built a contingency for it. Roman exhaled. Sterling didn't just want the alliance, Claire. He wanted control over me. If I cooperated, he had a partner he could manage. If I refused, he had a weapon he could use to destroy me. Either outcome served him. Claire turned her eyes back to Roman. Then we need Marsh, she said. Yes, and finding Marsh with Sterling's resources behind his disappearance is going to be. Decker is already on it. Claire nodded slowly. Warren needs to know about the access logs and the deleted partition first thing in the morning. If we bring this to him before Sterling's attorneys have time to establish their narrative with the review board, we change the sequence. I'll call him at 7, Roman said. They sat with it for a moment. The lamp, the quiet of the apartment at midnight, the particular intimacy of two people sitting inside a disaster together, not pretending it wasn't a disaster, just sharing the weight of it. Then Claire said, Roman, Marsh was inside your operation. I know. He had access to your documents for 6 years. I know. Whoever turned him had to know enough about your internal structure to know he existed. To know his access level, to know his habits. She paused. That's not information Sterling could have obtained from outside. Roman looked at her. The thought had been forming at the edge of his mind since Decker gave him the name, and he'd started calculating backward through 6 years of Philip Marsh's access and the specific knowledge required to identify him as the right tool for this particular job. He had not wanted to arrive at the conclusion it was pointing toward, because the conclusion was worse than the trap itself. Someone gave Sterling the blueprint, Roman said. Yes. Someone who knew the inside of my operation well enough to identify Marsh as the vulnerability. Yes. Not just someone with general knowledge, Roman said. Someone with specific knowledge, access-level knowledge. The kind you only have if you've been inside long enough to see how the document approval process actually works rather than how it looks on paper. The silence between them was different now, heavier. How many people have that level of knowledge? Claire asked. Roman thought about it, honestly, which was harder than it sounded, because honest thinking required him to consider names attached to faces, attached to years of history, and the exercise of doing that with genuine suspicion rather than loyalty was one of the most corrosive things a man in his position could do to himself. 6, he said, maybe 7. Claire nodded. Neither of them said anything else that night. The next morning, Roman met with Warren Ellsworth at 7:15 in Warren's office. He brought the access log documentation Decker had compiled overnight. Warren read it with the focused silence of a man building a legal architecture in real time, making small notations in the margin with a mechanical pencil, his expression revealing nothing, his expression except the particular intensity of someone who has just received information that meaningfully changes what he's working with. When Warren finished, he set the documents down and looked at Roman. The fragments from the deleted partition, Warren said. Decker's IT contact, is he someone whose findings will survive a challenge to their credibility? He's an independent contractor with a federal certification and a 15-year record, Roman said. He's testified in 3 federal cases. His methodology is documented. Warren nodded, made another notation. If we can establish the modification timeline through the access logs combined with the partition fragments, we can present a compelling argument that the financial schedules currently attached to your signed approvals are not the documents you approved. That's meaningful. That's the kind of evidence that changes a forensic review's direction. He paused. But I want to be direct with you about what it doesn't do. Tell me. It raises doubt, significant doubt. It establishes that tampering occurred. What it cannot do, without Philip Marsh's testimony or the complete reconstruction of the original documents, is definitively prove what you actually approved. Sterling's attorneys will argue that the modification evidence is circumstantial. They'll argue that Marsh acted independently, Sterling's direction, without Sterling's direction, and that the connection to Sterling is speculative. Can they make that argument credibly? Roman asked. Credibly enough to create a prolonged review process, Warren said, which is itself a form of damage. Your name remains associated with a financial investigation for months. Claire's acquisition of the Meridian entities remains under scrutiny. The operational separations remain in place. Sterling doesn't need to win a legal battle to hurt you. He just needs to keep the battle going long enough. Roman sat across from Warren's desk and thought about what it meant to play a long game against a man who had already been playing one for 9 months, while Roman believed they were building something together. Find Marsh, Warren said. That's the priority. Everything else is containment until Marsh is located. Roman's phone buzzed on Warren's desk. He looked at the screen. Decker. Excuse me, Roman said, and picked up. Decker said, I have a location. Preliminary. I need 2 hours to confirm. Roman stood. Send it when you have confirmation. He ended the call and looked at Warren. Marsh may be within reach, he said. Warren's expression didn't change. Roman, whatever you're considering. I'm going to talk to him, Roman said. If Marsh has been coached by Sterling's people, a conversation conducted outside of legal channels could. I'll bring you the conversation, Roman said. Recorded, documented, and conducted in the presence of a witness. I won't touch him. I won't threaten him. I will sit across from Philip Marsh, and I will ask him to tell me what happened to those documents, and I will record his answer, and I will bring it back to you. Warren studied him for a moment, with the careful expression of a man assessing whether the thing being promised was the thing that would actually happen. The witness, Warren said. Who? Claire, Roman said. He left Warren's office and drove back across the city with Marcus, and he had been in the car for 14 minutes when his phone rang again, and this time it was not Decker. It was Gerald Foss, his own attorney. And Gerald's voice had a quality in it that Roman had heard exactly twice in 11 years of working together, the voice of a man delivering information so bad that the professional composure he depended on was struggling to fully contain it. Roman, Gerald said, I need you to come to my office. What happened? The regulatory submission, Gerald said. Sterling filed it this morning. Not a preliminary inquiry. A formal complaint to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It names you specifically. Roman's jaw tightened. He moved faster than we expected. Roman. Gerald paused. The complaint also names Claire. The car was very quiet. Say that again, Roman said. The complaint names Claire Vexley and Hawthorne Dominion as co-participants in an alleged scheme to conceal and redistribute the $14 million in losses through the Meridian acquisition. Sterling is arguing that the acquisition itself was conducted to bury evidence. Roman sat in the back seat of his armored car in the gray morning light of Chicago and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not anger. He knew anger. Anger was hot, and it moved fast, and it told you what to do with your hands. This was different. This was the cold kind. The kind that settled into a man's chest and stayed there, quiet and heavy, and absolutely without mercy. Sterling had named Claire. He had named her, not because he believed she was guilty of anything, but because naming her was the most effective way to apply maximum pressure to Roman in minimum time. Because Sterling understood, in the way that men who have spent their lives studying leverage understand it, that Roman Vexley could absorb damage to himself with considerable resilience, but damage to Claire was a different and more operative threat. I'm on my way, Roman said. Gerald's office was 15 minutes away. In those 15 minutes, Roman sat without speaking and thought about the sequence Sterling had just executed. The formal complaint was not an escalation of the strategy, it was the strategy. The one that had been planned from the beginning, the final mechanism of the 9-month trap. The documents had been designed to implicate Roman. The complaint had been designed to make the implication official. And naming Claire had been designed to make Roman feel the walls close so fast and so hard that he would make a mistake. Because Sterling expected Roman to respond to this the way Roman Vexley had always responded to threats in his professional life. Directly, immediately, with the kind of force that had no legal standing and left marks. Roman walked into Gerald's office, sat down across from his attorney, and spent 45 minutes going through the complaint document with the methodical precision of a man who was not going to give Sterling the reaction Sterling was counting on. Then he called Claire. She answered on the second ring. I know, she said before he could speak. Warren called you. 5 minutes ago. Her voice was level. He could hear what was underneath it, but the surface was holding. Roman, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening. Whatever you're feeling right now. Claire, whatever you're feeling, she said again, I need you to put it in a room and close the door. Not because it isn't real, not because it isn't justified. Because if you act on it, Sterling gets exactly what he built this for. He needs you to be Roman Vexley, the criminal. He needs you to confirm every assumption the regulatory complaint is designed to create. The moment you step outside the legal process, he wins. Roman was quiet. I know, he said. Do you? Yes. Another pause. Where are you? Gerald's office. Stay there. Warren is coming to you. We're going to map the next 72 hours together, and we're going to do this the way it has to be done. Her voice had shifted. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that was not the careful, measured quality of a woman managing a crisis. Was sharper than that. Older. The voice of a woman who had been sitting on something enormous for a very long time and had just felt the last reason for restraint evaporate. Roman. Sterling named me. I know. He named me because he thought it would make you reckless. I know that too. I need you to understand something, Claire said, and her voice had gone to a register he had never heard from her in 12 years of knowing her. Not in the worst nights, not in the hardest moments, not in any of the rooms they had navigated together, when everything was on fire. It was the voice of a woman who had been careful and patient and strategic and quiet for 8 years and had just reached the precise end of all of that. Sterling named me, in a federal complaint, because he believed I was nobody. Because he looked at me Friday night and decided I was a decoration with no independent standing and no capacity to be anything other than a liability attached to my husband's name. Claire, I have been a billionaire for 4 years, she said very quietly. I have restructured 11 companies, created approximately 2,000 jobs, and built the investment portfolio that now controls 58% of everything Sterling Haverford spent 30 years accumulating. I did all of it without a single person outside of a small legal team knowing my name. I did it quietly because I needed it to be mine. A pause. He named me because he thought I was no one. I'm going to let him find out who he actually named. Roman sat in Gerald's office with the phone to his ear and felt something move through him that was not anger and was not pride exactly, but was something in the same territory as both. What are you going to do? He said. What I've always done, Claire said. Exactly what needs to be done. And this time I'm not going to do it quietly. She ended the call. Roman sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he put it face down on Gerald's desk, looked at his attorney, and said, "Whatever your current read is on the complaint, double it. Whatever you thought we were prepared for, we need to be prepared for more. Because the next phase of this is going to move faster than anything we've seen so far." Gerald, to his credit, simply opened his notepad and said, "Tell me what you need." Decker's confirmed location arrived at 2:17 p.m. in the afternoon. Philip Marsh was in a rental property in Evanston, 40 minutes north of the city. The property had been leased under a name Decker's people had taken 6 hours to trace back through 3 shell accounts to a property management company with a board member whose financial history connected, 3 degrees removed, to a Sterling Haverford holding company. Sterling had not just moved Marsh, he had housed him. He was maintaining him. Which meant Marsh was not a loose end. Sterling intended to permanently eliminate. He was a controlled asset. Sterling intended to produce at the moment of his choosing, with a prepared story, in a context Sterling had designed. Roman and Claire drove to Evanston together. Marcus drove. Roman sat in the back with Claire, and neither of them talked about what they were doing or what they were prepared to say. They had discussed it in the 40 minutes between Warren's arrival at Gerald's office and the departure, what questions to ask, what not to say, how to record it, how to ensure it was legally usable. They had been methodical about it because methodical was the only thing available to them right now. What Roman had not discussed with anyone was what he felt when he thought about Philip Marsh. 6 years. Philip Marsh had sat inside Roman's operation for 6 years, with the access and the trust that came from 6 years of perfect performance. And at some point, Roman didn't know when, didn't know how Sterling had made contact, didn't know what had been offered or threatened, or both Marsh had made a decision to use that access against the man who had given it to him. Roman understood betrayal. He had been in a world built on it for 2 decades. He had seen men betray their partners, their organizations, their families, and themselves for combinations of money and fear that Roman could have predicted if he'd been paying closer attention. He had never believed himself immune to it. But sitting in the car watching the northern neighborhoods of Chicago give way to the quieter streets of Evanston, Roman understood that what was moving through him was not just the professional anger of a man whose operation had been compromised. It was something more personal than that, something that had to do with the specific quality of trust he extended to the people closest to his work, and what it cost when that trust was found to have been misplaced. The rental property was a two-story house on a tree-lined street that looked exactly like every other house on the same block, the particular anonymity of a place, chosen specifically to disappear into its surroundings. Marcus parked half a block down. Roman and Claire walked to the front door together. Roman knocked. Silence. He knocked again. The door opened. Philip Marsh looked exactly as Roman remembered him, slight, careful, the kind of man whose face defaulted to a neutral expression that could be read as either attentiveness or absence, depending on what you were looking for. He was in jeans and a plain gray shirt. His face, when he registered who was standing in his doorway, did something complicated and rapid that moved through surprise and into something that was not quite fear, but was close enough that the distinction barely mattered. "Mr. Vexley," he said. "Philip," Roman said. Marsh looked at Claire. He looked at the phone Roman was visibly holding, with the recording application running. He looked back at Roman. I'm not supposed to," he stopped. Started again. "I was told not to speak to anyone connected to." "I know what you were told," Roman said. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to hurt you. I want you to look at me and understand that clearly before anything else." He waited until Marsh met his eyes. "I want to talk. That's all. You can close the door if you want. But before you do, I want you to understand what happens if you close this door and I walk away without your testimony." Marsh swallowed. "What happens?" he said. "The forensic review establishes that documents were modified. The access logs establish that you were the person with the access to modify them. The deleted partition fragments establish the timing. And Sterling's attorney produces you in a prepared setting to tell a story that places all of the criminal liability on you and none of it on him." Roman kept his voice even. "Because Sterling doesn't need you anymore, Philip. He needed you to modify the documents. You did that. You're housed in a property he controls, which means you're a controlled asset, which means at some point in this process he's going to produce you in a way that is designed to serve his interests, which are not your interests." Marsh was very still in the doorway. "He told me I'd be protected," Marsh said. His voice was quiet. The voice of a man who had been telling himself something for long enough that he was beginning to hear how it sounded. "He told you what he needed you to believe," Roman said. Marsh looked at Claire again. Something in his expression shifted the particular look of a person doing a calculation they don't want to be doing and arriving at an answer they don't want to have. "If I talk to you," Marsh said, "and Sterling finds out." "Sterling will find out," Roman said. "I won't pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that your cooperation with an independent forensic review is the only path that ends with you being accountable for what you actually did rather than for everything Sterling needs someone to be accountable for." Marsh stood in the doorway of the house. Sterling had rented for him to disappear in, and he looked at Roman Vexley, and Roman watched him make the decision in real time. Marsh opened the door wider. They sat in the rental house's bare living room, 3 chairs, a folding table, the particular emptiness of a space no one had made into a home, and for the next 90 minutes, Philip Marsh told them everything. He had been approached 8 months ago, not by Sterling, directly by an intermediary, a financial consultant whose name Marsh provided, and Roman recognized as someone with documented access to Sterling's inner circle. The offer had been money, significant money, enough to resolve a private debt situation Marsh had been quietly managing. For 2 years, a situation Roman had not known existed because Marsh had been careful and Roman had not been looking. The ask had been specific access to 7 files, replacement of the financial schedules only. No other modifications. Restoration of the originals to the accessible system was not required. Marsh had been told Roman would never face real consequences. He had been told it was a leverage play, that the documents would never be formally submitted. He had been told specifically that Claire would not be involved. When Roman asked him, when he had learned about the Finson complaint, Marsh's expression did the thing that confirmed what Roman already suspected. "Yesterday," Marsh said, he had learned about the formal regulatory complaint, the one that named Claire, from a news alert on his phone in the rental house. Sterling had put him in for his protection. Sterling had named Claire without telling the man he was using as his primary instrument. That was not an oversight. It was a demonstration of what Marsh's value to Sterling actually was: operational, temporary, entirely disposable the moment the operation was complete. Marsh understood that now. Roman could see him understanding it in real time, watching it move through the man's face the way water moves through a crack, slow at first, then all at once. "I'll testify," Marsh said, "to everything, whatever you need." Roman looked at Claire. She was watching Marsh with an expression that was not compassion exactly, and not contempt exactly, but something between them, the look of a woman who understood what it was to make a decision based on information that turned out to be wrong, and was not prepared to extend unlimited grace for it, but was also not going to stand between a man and the only useful thing he could still do. "Warren Ellsworth will contact you tonight," Claire said. "Don't go anywhere. Don't contact anyone connected to Sterling. If someone from his side reaches out, don't respond, call Warren immediately." Marsh nodded. They drove back to the city in the gathering dark of a Tuesday afternoon, and Roman sat with a recorded testimony and the access logs and the deleted partition fragments, and Philip Marsh's agreement to cooperate. And he looked out the window at Chicago, coming back into focus through the gray light, and he thought about the fact that none of this was over. They had Marsh. They had the evidence. They had the testimony. What they did not have was the person inside Roman's organization who had identified Marsh as the vulnerability in the first place. Because Philip Marsh, when Roman had asked him directly, had told him one more thing. The intermediary who approached him had known Marsh's debt situation, the specific amount, the specific creditor, information that was not in any document Marsh had ever filed, not in any financial record connected to his employment, not in any place. Sterling Heffer's people could have found it without someone who knew Marsh personally pointing them toward it. Someone inside Roman's world had handed Sterling the key. That person was still there, still present, still trusted, still with access to whatever came next. Roman looked at the city through the car window and felt the trap reconfigure itself around him, not closing, exactly, but changing shape, becoming something more complex than he had initially understood, with a layer beneath the layer he'd already found. He had been so focused on Sterling. He had been so focused on the documents, the forensic review, the regulatory complaint, the alliance that had become a weapon, the 9 months of careful construction Sterling had done in plain sight. He had not been focused on the door Sterling had used to get inside. That door was still open. And whoever had opened it was still standing on the other side of it, watching Roman work through the layers, getting closer and waiting to find out if Roman would reach them before they decided it was time to ensure he couldn't. Roman didn't sleep Tuesday night. He sat in his office with the recording of Philip Marsh's testimony playing on repeat, not because he needed to hear it again. He had memorized the relevant sections within the first 2 listens, but because he was using it as a fixed point while the rest of his mind worked the other problem. The one underneath the one they'd already solved. Someone inside his organization had handed Sterling the key. That person knew Marsh's debt situation, the specific amount, the specific creditor, personal information that existed nowhere in any professional record. The kind of information you accumulated about a person, not through documents but through proximity, through the particular intimacy of shared space and overheard conversations, and the way people talk differently when they believe no one consequential is paying attention. Roman built a list in his head. Then he wrote it on paper because the act of writing it made it real in a way that thinking it didn't. 6 names. The 6 people with sufficient institutional knowledge to have identified Philip Marsh as the vulnerability, to have known his access level, his habits, his personal financial situation, the specific nature of a debt that Marsh had been careful never to discuss at work, but had apparently discussed with someone. He looked at the 6 names. Then he looked at them again. Then he picked up his phone and called Decker at 2 in the morning. Decker answered on the second ring, which was how Roman knew he hadn't been sleeping either. "The intermediary Marsh named," Roman said. "The financial consultant. I need his phone records for the last 12 months. And I need the financial records for the 6 people on the list I'm about to send you." not professional records, personal, bank accounts, private transactions, anything that moved outside normal channels. That'll take time, Decker said. How much time? 48 hours if I push it. Push it. He sent the list. Then he sat in his office until 4 in the morning, and when he finally accepted that sleep was not available to him, he went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the window, looking at the city in the dark, and thought Sterling Haverford, sitting somewhere in the same city right now, probably not sleeping either, probably running his own calculations, probably already adjusting his strategy to account for the fact that Roman had found Marsh before the review board did. Because Sterling would know. Roman had no doubt about that. Whatever communication channel connected Sterling to the rental house in Evanston, it was active. And the moment Marsh agreed to testify, someone had either told Sterling directly or Sterling's people had registered the anomaly of an unscheduled visitor and drawn the correct conclusion. Sterling was adjusting. The question was what direction he was adjusting in. Claire came into the kitchen at 4:30. She was in the gray sweater she wore when she couldn't sleep, the one with the cuff that had been fraying for 3 years that she refused to replace because Roman had given it to her during a winter when they couldn't afford much of anything else. She looked at him standing at the window with his coffee, and she didn't ask if he was okay because she could see that okay was not currently the operating condition. She poured herself coffee and stood beside him at the window. 6 names, Roman said. I know. One of them. I know. I've worked with some of them for over a decade. Claire looked at the city in the dark. Do you have a read? I have a feeling, Roman said. I don't trust feelings right now. I want the financials first. She nodded. They stood at the window together, drinking coffee in the 4:30 dark, and Roman appreciated, with the specific quality of appreciation that arrives only when things are genuinely bad, that this was the woman who had stayed. Not the woman he had defended at a dinner table, not the woman who had turned out to be a billionaire. The woman who got up at 4:30 when he couldn't sleep and stood beside him at a window and didn't try to make the night smaller than it was. Wednesday moved. Warren filed the access log evidence and the deleted partition documentation with the Forensic Review Board at 9 in the morning, accompanied by a formal notification of Philip Marsh's cooperation agreement. Sterling's attorneys responded by noon with a motion challenging the admissibility of evidence obtained outside formal channels. Warren had anticipated the motion and had a response prepared that cited 3 directly applicable precedents. The review board acknowledged both filings and indicated a preliminary determination on admissibility within 72 hours. 72 hours. Roman sat through 2 hours of legal strategy in Warren's office on Wednesday afternoon and emerged understanding that the forensic review was a process that would move at the speed the review board determined, and that the review board was a body that had its own institutional rhythms and was not susceptible to being rushed by either side's urgency. 3 days. He had 3 days before the review board's preliminary ruling, which would determine whether the modification evidence was usable. 3 days during which Sterling had the regulatory complaint active, Roman's name was attached to a federal financial inquiry, and the person who had opened the door for Sterling was still inside his organization with full access to whatever happened next. On Wednesday evening, Decker called. I have something, he said, but I need to show it to you in person. Roman drove to Decker's office, not Decker's official office, the one connected to Vexley Holdings' legitimate operations, but the secondary location that functioned as Decker's actual workspace, a nondescript suite above a dry cleaning business in Wicker Park that Roman had been to exactly 4 times in the previous 2 years. Decker had 3 monitors running when Roman arrived. He was a large man, quiet in the way that large men who have trained themselves to be unobtrusive often are, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific stillness of someone who had spent a career finding information that other people had gone to significant effort to keep hidden. He did not express emotion about the things he found. He reported them and let Roman do the emoting. He pointed to the center monitor. This is the financial consultant Marsh named, Decker said. The intermediary. His name is Callum Reyes. He operates out of a registered financial advisory firm with 7 clients, 4 of which are legitimate and 3 of which are shells with no clear business purpose. In the last 14 months, Reyes received 4 payments from one of those shells, totaling $320,000. That's the Sterling connection, Roman said. Yes. Now here. Decker shifted to the right monitor. These are the personal financial records for the 6 names you sent me. He pulled up a split screen. 5 of them show nothing unusual. Normal transaction patterns, no unexplained movements, nothing that connects to Reyes or to the shell accounts. He paused. The 6th, Roman said. Decker pointed. Roman looked at the screen. He stood very still for a long time. The 6th name on his list was Daniel Faro. Daniel Faro, who had been Roman's head of strategic planning for 9 years, who had been present in more internal briefings than anyone else on the list, who had Roman's complete operational trust because 9 years of consistent, intelligent, apparently loyal service was the kind of track record that accumulated trust the way compound interest accumulated money quietly, reliably, and to a total that only became visible when you actually stopped to count it. Who had received, according to the records on Decker's monitor, 2 wire transfers from a private account connected to Callum Reyes. The first 8 months ago, the second 5 months ago. Combined total, $400,000, both transferred through a personal investment account Faro had opened 2 years ago at an institution with no connection to any of his documented financial life. $400,000. 9 years. Roman looked at the numbers on the screen for a long time. Long enough that Decker, who understood Roman's silences, said nothing and did not move. He was in the room, Roman said finally, when I discussed the Meridian Alliance. When I discussed the approval process. When I discussed. He stopped. Started again. He was in the room for all of it. Yes, Decker said. He knew Marsh's access level because he reviewed the operational structure report that categorized document approval access by employee. He would have seen Marsh's debt situation because Roman paused, working backward. The Employee Financial Assistance Program. 2 years ago, Marsh applied for an advance through the program. Faro was on the review committee. Decker nodded slowly. Marsh's debt situation was in the program's application files. Accessible to the review committee, Faro would have seen the creditor and the amount. 9 years. Roman stepped back from the monitors. He turned and walked to the window of Decker's secondary office and looked down at the street below. A sound like green at the dry cleaning business's lit sign and the ordinary Wednesday night foot traffic of a neighborhood that had no idea what was happening in the room above it. He thought about 9 years, the specific texture of them. The meetings where Faro had been the one to identify an operational weakness before anyone else saw it, and Roman had assumed that was intelligence. The strategy sessions where Faro had consistently pushed for more aggressive expansion of the Meridian relationship. And Roman had assumed that was business instinct. The particular way Faro had managed to be present at every consequential conversation without ever appearing to engineer his presence, because a man who has been inside an organization for 9 years develops a natural rhythm that looks like institutional loyalty and is actually something else entirely. Roman turned away from the window. "Where is Faro right now?" he said. "He left the office at 6. His car was tracked to his apartment. He's been there since. Does he know we're looking?" The financial records search was conducted through back channels. Nothing that would have generated an alert he'd have access to. Decker paused. "But if Sterling knows about Marsh's cooperation and Roman, we have to assume Sterling knows then. Faro knows the situation has changed. Whether he's preparing to run or waiting to see which way it falls, I can't tell you." Roman looked at the monitors one more time. Then he pulled out his phone and called Claire. She answered immediately. "Faro," he said. Silence on her end. 3 seconds of it. Then, "Are you sure?" Financial records, wire transfers, $400,000 across 2 payments. He had access to Marsh's personal debt situation through the Employee Assistance Program. Another silence, longer Roman. Her voice had changed. This was not the controlled, strategic voice, or the careful, emotional voice, or any of the voices he was accustomed to mapping. This was something rawer. "Daniel Faro has been at your holiday table. He was at our anniversary dinner 2 years ago. I know, Roman said. He sat across from us, and he was already. Claire, she stopped. I need you to call Warren, Roman said. Tonight. Right now. Faro's financial records need to be in front of the Forensic Review Board's preliminary assessment before Sterling's attorneys file anything else. If we can establish the Sterling Rice Faro chain before the admissibility ruling, we change what the ruling is about. He heard her breath, the particular controlled exhale of a woman wrestling something very large into a shape she could work with. All right, she said in Claire. Don't tell anyone else. Not yet. She understood what he meant. If Faro learned his financial records had surfaced before Roman had the opportunity to confront him directly, he would run. And a man with $400,000 in an off-book account and Sterling Haverford's people providing his exit route could disappear in a way that would take months to untangle. They needed Faro in place for one more day. Roman left Decker's office and drove back across the city. He sat in the back of the car with the particular stillness of a man who had located the source of a wound and was now managing the complex problem of extracting it without losing more blood in the process. Marcus drove without speaking. He had learned Roman silences, too. Thursday morning arrived with the specific cruelty of an unremarkable day that had no idea how much was up to happen inside it. Roman was at his legitimate offices by 7:30. He moved through the morning with complete normality, his assistant's briefing, 2 calls with the construction division, a review of the logistics, quarterly numbers. He was present. He was functioning. He gave nothing away. Faro arrived at 8:15, as he always did. Roman watched him cross the open floor through the glass wall of his office. Faro's movement was normal. His expression was composed. If he was managing something, he was managing it with the practiced ease of a man who had been managing it for 9 months while sitting 15 feet from the person he was managing it against. Roman waited until 10. Then he called Faro into his office, told his assistant to hold everything, and closed the door. Faro sat across Roman's desk in the chair he had occupied hundreds of times across 9 years. He had his notebook as he always did. His jacket was on. He looked, as he always looked, like the most reliable person in the room. Roman looked at him for a moment without speaking. Faro met his eyes. The composure held. It was very good composure. 9 years of practice. Callum Reyes, Roman said. Something moved in Faro's face. Immediate, involuntary. The specific flicker of a man whose nervous system has received a stimulus it wasn't prepared for, lasting less than a second before the composure reasserted itself. But Roman had been reading faces in dangerous rooms for 20 years. He saw it. I don't know that name, Faro said. His voice was steady. It was impressively steady. Roman noted that with the detached part of his mind that was always cataloging, always assessing, even now. $400,000, Roman said. 2 wire transfers. 8 months ago and 5 months ago. Through a private account at Midwest Horizon Trust that you opened 2 years ago and have never mentioned to anyone. Faro's jaw tightened. Roman Philip Marsh is cooperating with the Forensic Review, Roman said. He named Reyes as the intermediary who approached him. Reyes's financial records connect to Sterling's shell accounts. Your financial records connect to Reyes. The chain is complete, and it is currently in front of Warren Ellsworth, who filed it with the review board at 9:15 this morning. The composure broke. Not dramatically. Not with the collapse that happens in films, the sudden crumpling of a man confronted with his worst moment. It broke the way composure actually breaks in real life slowly, in pieces starting around the eyes which could not maintain the quality of controlled blankness once the information had fully arrived and settled. Faro set his notebook on the desk. His hands were not entirely steady. How long have you been sitting with it? Roman asked. His voice was very quiet, the dangerous quiet. Roman, How long? Faro looked at the desk. 8 months, he said. 8 months. While Roman had been cultivating the Meridian Alliance. While Faro had been in every strategic meeting about it, contributing his usual intelligent assessments, apparently working toward the same goals. While Faro had been the person in the room when Roman discussed the approval process, the documentation structure, which employees handled, which functions. What did he offer you? Roman Sterling. through Reyes. What was the offer? Faro's mouth was tight. A position, he said, in the restructured Meridian operation, head of strategy. Salary that was 3 times what he stopped. 3 times, Roman said, and the 400,000 was a retainer. For information. What information? Strategic positioning. The Meridian alliance structure. Your approval process. Faro looked up, and his eyes were doing something complicated. Not quite remorse, not quite defiance. Something caught between them. Your operational vulnerabilities. Roman was quiet for a long moment. You gave him Marsh, Roman said. I identified that Marsh's access level and financial situation created a workable. You gave him Marsh, Roman said again. The same volume, the same register, and something in it made Faro stop talking immediately. Roman stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to Faro and looked at the city for 30 seconds and did something extremely difficult, which was the specific discipline of not doing the thing his body was configured to do in this situation. 20 years of operating in a world where betrayal had an immediate and physical answer. 20 years of understanding that the reason people didn't betray him was because the cost of betrayal was clearly communicated and consistently enforced. He stood at the window and remembered what Claire had said. If you step outside the legal process, Sterling wins. He turned around. Faro was still in the chair, hands flat on the desk now, watching Roman with the expression of a man who was preparing for something and didn't know which direction it was coming from. You're going to call Warren Ellsworth, Roman said. Right now, from this room. You're going to volunteer a full accounting of every piece of information you provided to Reyes, every communication you had with Sterling's people, every operational detail you disclosed. You're going to document it completely, and you're going to cooperate with the forensic review without reservation. Faro blinked. And if I don't, then what I have, which is already significant, goes to the review board without your cooperation. And you face the full weight of what 9 months of corporate espionage and financial fraud looks like without the benefit of a cooperation agreement. Roman walked back to his desk. Or you call Warren, right now, and you give the review the complete picture, which is the only thing that has any chance of establishing the full scope of Sterling's operation, which is what actually clears my name entirely rather than partially. He put his phone on the desk between them and slid it toward Faro. Faro looked at the phone. 9 years of history in that room. 9 years of a man Roman had trusted with the architecture of operation, sitting across desks and deciding whether the thing he had sold was worth what it was going to cost him. Faro picked up the phone. The call to Warren lasted 11 minutes. Roman stood at his window and looked at the city and listened to Faro's voice behind him. Going through it, the initial contact from Reyes, the 3 meetings, the information exchanged, the documents accessed, the specific guidance provided regarding Marsh's vulnerability. Faro's voice was steadier than Roman expected. The voice of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had, in the absence of any other option, simply put it down. When the call ended, Faro set the phone on Roman's desk. Roman turned around. Get out, he said. Not loudly. Completely without heat. The flat statement of a man who has extracted the useful thing and no longer requires the person who provided it to remain in the room. Faro left. Warren called 20 minutes later. Faro's cooperation combined with the Reyes financial chain and Marsh's testimony gives us a documented conspiracy that traces directly to Sterling, Warren said. This is no longer a forensic review about document tampering. This is evidence of a coordinated 9-month scheme to commit financial fraud and obstruct regulatory processes. I'm filing a formal complaint with Finson this afternoon that counters Sterling's filing and presents this evidence as a counter-narrative to the original complaint. Timeline, Roman said. The review board has requested an emergency session for tomorrow afternoon. Both sides present. They'll rule on admissibility and preliminary findings simultaneously. Tomorrow afternoon. After 9 months of Sterling's construction and 4 days of Roman's dismantling, it was going to come down to a room, a boardroom, a table, both sides presenting what they had to a body of people who would determine which version of the truth had stronger structural support. Roman looked at his watch. It was 11:40 in the morning. He had approximately 26 hours. He called Claire. Tomorrow afternoon, he said. Review board emergency session. Warren's filing the counter-complaint this afternoon. A pause. That's faster than Warren expected. Sterling's attorneys will file something tonight to try to preempt the session. Warren's move is to get the counter-complaint in before they do. Will it hold? It should. The chain is complete. Marsh, Race, Faro, Sterling, documented, financially evidenced, with 2 cooperation agreements and forensic metadata. He paused. It should be enough. Should, Claire said. It's what we have. Another pause. Longer. He could hear her thinking the particular qualities of her silences when she was working through something with the methodical precision she brought to everything that mattered. Roman, she said, Sterling is going to be in that room tomorrow. Yes. He's going to stand there with his attorneys and present whatever version of this he's constructed, and he's going to look at both of us, and he's going to perform complete confidence because that is what he does. That is how he has survived in rooms like that for 30 years. Yes, Roman said. I want to be at the table, Claire said. Not behind Warren, not as an observer. At the table, as the controlling owner of Hawthorne Dominion, as the counterparty to the acquisition he's trying to unwind, as the person named in his regulatory complaint. I want to be in front of him, Roman, in that room. Roman thought about Friday night, the dining table, the glass raised in his direction, dead weight, the laughter. 2 seconds of his own voice in that laughter, that he would spend a long time making right. You'll be at the table, he said. One more thing, Claire said. I've been going through Sterling's legitimate corporate structure, the entity Hawthorne now controls. There are 3 board positions currently occupied by Sterling's direct appointees. I have the authority to call a board vote to remove them. If I do it tonight, before the emergency session tomorrow, Sterling walks into that room without his internal board support. Roman went still. Can you do it legally, he said. Warren drafted the authorization this morning. It was his idea. As controlling shareholder, the vote can be conducted by written consent, no physical meeting required. A pause. Sterling would receive notification tonight. He would know before he walks into that room tomorrow that he no longer has his board. Do it, Roman said. He drove home at 2 in the afternoon for the first time in 4 days. He ate something real. Claire had made soup, actual soup from actual ingredients, because she cooked when she was processing things, and she had clearly been processing a great deal. They sat at the kitchen table and ate, and didn't talk about tomorrow for the first 20 minutes, and they did. They talked until 9 at night, not about strategy. Warren had strategy. They talked about the things underneath strategy the 8 years, the secrecy that had become fear, the Friday dinner that had cracked something open, the Monday boardroom that had changed its shape, a sound like green wood splitting, the particular long view of a marriage that had been built through difficulty, and was being tested through a different and more complicated difficulty now. Roman told her about standing at Faro's window, about the 20 seconds when the thing his body knew to do and the thing his mind had chosen to do had been in direct conflict, and the thing his mind had chosen had won. That's new, Claire said. Yes, he said. How did it feel? Roman thought about it honestly. Like losing and winning at the same time, he said. I don't have a better answer than that. Claire looked at him across the kitchen table. In the quiet of 9 o'clock, the soup bowls empty between them, and her expression was the one he'd been trying to read since Friday night, the complicated one. The one with layers he kept finding new depths in. That's probably the right answer, she said. They went to bed at 10. Roman slept. Not well deeply. But he slept, which was more than he'd managed any previous night this week. And when he woke at 6 Thursday morning, with the gray light coming through the curtains, and the city already audible below, he lay still for a moment and took stock. Marsh cooperating, Faro cooperating, Reyes chain documented. Warren's counter-complaint, filed at 4:15 yesterday afternoon, confirmed received by Finson and the review board. Sterling's board positions voted out by written consent at 11:30, last night notification delivered to Sterling's attorneys at midnight. Roman sat up. Claire was already awake. He could hear her in the other room on the phone with Warren, her voice quiet and precise. He dressed. He stood at the bathroom mirror for a moment and looked at his own face. 4 days of this. The particular quality it left on a man, not exhaustion exactly, but the specific wear of sustained intensity, of operating for 96 hours at the edge of every capability and holding the shape of himself through it. He looked tired. He thought, like a man who was about to walk into the most consequential room of his life without the armor he had spent 20 years assembling, because the armor didn't work in this room. Criminal reputation didn't work in this room. Fear didn't work in this room. The instruments that had made Roman Vexley dangerous were not the instruments that won tomorrow afternoon. What worked in that room was what Warren had prepared, what Marsh had testified to, what Faro had confirmed, what the forensic metadata established, what Claire had built over 8 years and was now prepared to put on the table in full. Roman was not the weapon in this room. Evidence was the weapon. Restraint was the weapon. The discipline of having chosen, 4 days in a row, not to be the version of himself that Sterling expected, that was the weapon. He walked out green, splitting. He walked out of the bathroom and into the living room where Claire was finishing her call with Warren, and she turned and looked at him, and he looked back at her and she said, "Warren says we're ready." Roman picked up his jacket. "Let's go," he said. The review board's emergency session was held in a conference facility on the 32nd floor of a downtown Chicago building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the lake. Gray light, gray water, the particular vast indifference of the lake on a November Thursday morning. Sterling Haverford arrived 4 minutes after Roman and Claire. He came with 3 attorneys, 2 financial advisors, and the particular quality of a man who had been in rooms like this one many times and had never lost inside them. He was silver-haired and composed, and his suit was impeccable, and when he registered Roman and Claire already seated at the table, his expression did the recalibrating thing, the rapid, controlled adjustment of a man who had expected to control the first impression of the room and found that control had already been claimed. He sat down across from them. For a moment, across the table of the review board's emergency session, Roman and Sterling Haverford looked directly at each other. Sterling's eyes were a particular shade of light gray, and what was in them right now was not the confidence he was performing with the rest of his posture. It was calculation. The calculation of a man rapidly assessing how much the other side knew, how well they could prove it, and what options remained in a situation that had moved considerably faster than he had planned for. Roman held his gaze. He thought about Friday night. The dining room. Sterling raising his glass with the particular comfort of a man who believed the person he was humiliating had no recourse. He thought about what Claire had said in the Meridian Capitol lobby on Monday morning, about the difference between removing a man who had built a 9-month trap and asking a man to step back temporarily to protect himself. Assaulting. He thought about 20 years of rooms full of dangerous people and the particular skill he had developed for knowing when the most dangerous thing in the room was the one nobody could see coming. Sterling looked away first. Warren opened his briefcase. The session was about to begin, and Roman Vexley sat at the table with his wife beside him, and the complete architecture of 9 months of Sterling's construction laid out in documented evidence before the people who would determine what it meant. And he felt something he had not felt in the 4 days since a man raised a glass across a dinner table and made the worst miscalculation of his career. He felt certain, not of the outcome. Certainty of outcome was for people who hadn't spent enough time in rooms where outcomes refused to behave, but certain of something more specific and more durable than outcome. He had done the right thing, every step. The walk out of the dining room, the restraint at Faro's window, the choice to hand Sterling to evidence rather than to the instruments Roman had spent 20 years building. He had done it correctly, and he had done it in the hardest possible way, which was the only way it was worth doing. Warren laid the first document on the table. Across from them, Sterling's lead attorney reached for her pen, and the room that would determine everything tightened around all of them like a held breath, waiting to find out which version of the truth was strong enough to stand when everything else was stripped away. Warren laid the first document on the table, and the room changed temperature. It was not a dramatic change. The lighting didn't shift. Nobody raised their voice. The review board's 3 members, a forensic accountant named Huang, a retired federal regulatory examiner named Ostrowski, and a financial attorney named Delacroix, who chaired the panel, simply leaned forward, almost simultaneously. The way people lean forward when the thing in front of them requires closer attention than they had allocated coming in. Warren began with the metadata. He walked the panel through the access logs, methodically, document by document, timestamp by timestamp. Each of the 7 files, each of Marsh's off-hours access events. The 48 to 72-hour window between Roman's signatures and Marsh's system entries. The modification dates on the financial schedule attachments. The forensic IT specialist certification. The deleted partition fragments and the recovery methodology. Sterling's lead attorney, Patricia Venn, objected twice. Warren had anticipated both objections and had case citations prepared. The panel noted the objections and let Warren continue. Then Warren put Philip Marsh's cooperation agreement on the table, followed by the full transcript of the recorded testimony from the Evanston rental house, followed by the financial records tracing Callum Reyes from Sterling's Shell accounts to the payments received for coordinating the document tampering. Then Daniel Faro's cooperation agreement, his call transcript with Warren, the $400,000 in wire transfers through Midwest Horizon Trust, the documented access to the employee assistance program files that had given him Philip Marsh's private debt situation. Warren placed the documents in sequence, each one building on the last, the way a structure gets built, not dramatically, but with the accumulated weight of each piece resting correctly on the piece beneath it, until the whole thing was standing on its own and didn't require anyone to argue for its validity. Sterling sat across the table throughout. Roman watched him. Sterling's composure was professional. He had spent 30 years in rooms like this one, and his face had been trained by 3 decades of high-stakes negotiation to reveal nothing it had not chosen to reveal. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. His posture was upright. He listened to Warren's presentation with the focused attention of a man who was simultaneously absorbing what was being said and calculating what remained available to him in response. But Roman had been reading rooms full of dangerous people for 20 years. Sterling's right thumb moved, once, twice, a small pressing motion against the table's surface. The kind of involuntary repetition a body produces when the mind above it is working very hard to maintain a surface that is costing it more than expected. Roman noticed. He said nothing. He sat beside Claire with his hands quiet in front of him and let Warren do what Warren was built to do. When Warren finished laying the evidentiary foundation, he paused for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "We would like to draw the panel's attention to one additional element. The regulatory complaint filed against Roman and Claire Vexley by Mr. Haverford, specifically the allegation that Hawthorne Dominion's acquisition of 58% of Meridian Capital Partners was conducted to conceal evidence." He placed a single page on the table. The Meridian acquisition was completed and transferred 3 weeks before Mr. Haverford's dinner with the Vexleys, before the alliance was refused. Before any of the events Mr. Haverford's complaint characterizes as the motivation for the acquisition. Warren looked at the panel, not at Sterling. The acquisition did not follow the events Sterling Haverford describes as its cause. It preceded them by 22 days. The timeline of the regulatory complaint is factually inverted. Patricia Venn was already writing on her notepad, writing quickly. The writing of an attorney who has just watched the load-bearing wall of her client's position develop a structural problem. Chairman Delacroix looked up from the documents. He looked at Patricia Venn. Does the respondent wish to address the timeline discrepancy? Patricia Venn took exactly 5 seconds. We would request a brief recess to review. The timeline is in the acquisition transfer documents you have already received, Warren said pleasantly. It is not a matter requiring review. It is a matter of public record. Delacroix looked at the documents. He found the transfer date. He looked at the date of the dinner Sterling had referenced in his complaint. He set both pages side by side and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Sterling Haverford directly. Sterling looked back at him. The thumb stopped moving. "Mr. Haverford," Delacroix said, "I'd like to give you the opportunity to speak to what we've reviewed this morning." Not through counsel, directly. Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair. He had been in enough rooms to know that the moment had arrived, not the moment to fight, but the moment to perform the specific kind of controlled retreat that preserved what could still be preserved. The documents presented today raise questions that deserve thorough examination, Sterling said. His voice was measured, authoritative. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years making rooms believe he was the steadiest person in them. I engaged in a strategic alliance process with Roman Vexley in good faith. If individuals within that process engaged in unauthorized document manipulation, that is a matter I take seriously, and would cooperate with any investigation too. The individuals within that process, Roman said. It was the first time he had spoken since the session began. Sterling stopped. The panel looked at Roman. Warren looked at Roman. Claire's hand moved slightly on the table beside him, not reaching for him, just present, the small acknowledgement of a woman who knew her husband's voice at every register and was tracking this one carefully. Roman looked at Sterling. Callum Reyes, Roman said, who received $320,000 from your shell accounts. Daniel Farrow, who received $400,000 through Reyes. Philip Marsh, who was identified by Farrow and approached by Reyes and paid to modify documents inside my operation. He paused. The individuals within that process were yours. And the financial chain documenting that is in front of this panel. Sterling's jaw was tight. Mr. Vexley, Patricia Venn, began. I'm not talking to you, Roman said, without heat, without loudness, without anything other than the flat precision of a man who has decided exactly what he wants to say and is going to say it. He kept his eyes on Sterling. You built this for 9 months. You built it while we were building the alliance. You built it as the alternative outcome, the one you'd use if I refused you, or if the alliance went wrong, or if you ever needed someone else's name attached to something that needed to disappear. Sterling said nothing. You insulted my wife at a dinner table because you believed she was powerless, Roman said. You believed she was powerless because you had spent 3 months building a relationship with me and concluded that I was the only variable worth accounting for. That was your miscalculation, not one miscalculation. The same miscalculation repeated every time you looked at her and saw nothing worth calculating. He let that sit for a moment. You named her in a federal complaint, Roman said. She had been a billionaire for 4 years. She had acquired 58% of your legitimate corporate empire 3 weeks before you raised a glass to tell a table full of men she was worthless. And you named her in a federal complaint because you thought it was the most effective pressure point available to you. He paused. You were right that it was a pressure point. You were wrong about what kind. Sterling looked at Roman for a long moment. Something was happening in his face. Not collapse, not confession. Something more complicated, the expression of a man who has spent 30 years building defenses against external attack and is now confronting the specific vulnerability of having designed everything around a blueprint that turned out to be wrong. The board vote, Sterling said, quietly, almost to himself. Last night, Claire said. Sterling looked at her. He turned and looked at her directly, perhaps for the first time since Friday's dinner, without the particular dismissive flatness of a man cataloging something as irrelevant. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have fundamentally misidentified and are only now understanding the actual nature of. You had the votes before the session, he said. I had the authority, Claire said. I've had it for 3 weeks. The votes were a formality. Sterling was quiet. When you called me dead weight, Claire said, her voice level. The specific levelness who has had several days to decide exactly what she wanted to say in this room and has set in her head enough times to no longer need the volume for impact. You weren't wrong about what I looked like. You were wrong about what I was. She paused. I looked like a quiet woman in a dark dress at a dinner she'd been invited to as an accessory. That's what I allowed you to see. The difference between us is that I knew what I was. You decided what I was and never questioned the decision. Sterling looked at her for another moment. Then he said something that Roman had not expected. How long have you been building it? He said. Not strategically. Not as an attorney's question. As a genuine question. The question of a man who has just been forced to recalculate the size of something and is trying, belatedly, to understand its actual dimensions. 8 years, Claire said. Sterling absorbed that. He nodded once. A small movement, the reluctant acknowledgement of a man who respected, at least, the architecture of a long game. Then he turned to his attorney and said, Patricia, I want to discuss terms of cooperation with the panel. Patricia Venn looked at him. Sterling, we're past the point where fighting this serves anyone, he said. Including me. He straightened his jacket, the gesture of a man reasserting some control over a situation that had moved decisively out of his hands, finding the small dignity of at least choosing the moment to stop. Work out the framework with Warren. He stood. He looked at Roman. Roman looked back. When I insulted her, Sterling said, I genuinely believed she was nobody. He held Roman's gaze. I want you to know that's not a defense. I'm saying it because you should understand what I was actually looking at when I looked at your wife. He paused. I was looking for the thing that made her worth accounting for. I was looking for a title, an asset, a connection. I didn't find one, so I concluded there wasn't one. Another pause. The longest one. I was looking for the wrong thing. Roman said nothing. Sterling nodded once to no one in particular. Then he walked out of the review board session, and his attorneys stayed to negotiate the terms of his cooperation, and the room he left behind was very quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that follows the departure of something that had been generating enormous pressure and has now been removed. Chairman Delacroix looked at Warren. We'll need 48 hours to formally process the evidentiary submissions, Delacroix said. But I want to be direct with both sides. What's been presented today substantially alters the nature of the original complaint. I would characterize the panel's preliminary view as complete. Warren nodded. Roman sat for a moment longer. Then he looked at Claire. She was looking at the table, not at him, not at the panel, not at Sterling's departing back. At the table. The particular focused not looking of a woman who has been holding something at very high tension for a very long time and is in the first moments of feeling it release and is not entirely certain yet what her body is going to do with that. Roman put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that while Warren gathered documents around them, and the panel members conferred quietly at their end of the table, and the gray Chicago lake light came through the 32nd floor windows with its usual indifference to human events. After a while, Claire said quietly, It's done. It's done, Roman said. They sat a moment longer. Then they got up and went home. The formal clearance arrived 47 days later. 47 days of the particular grinding institutional machinery of regulatory review, the documented submissions, the panel's formal findings, the FinCEN counter-complaint resolution, the Meridian Board's acceptance of Sterling's removal, the cooperation agreements processed through their respective legal channels, the forensic review's final report, establishing with documented certainty that Roman Vexley's signatures had appeared on documents, subsequently altered without his knowledge or consent. 47 days, during which Roman went to his offices and managed his legitimate businesses and had dinner with his wife most nights at the kitchen table and did not run any of the operations that had formerly defined the Vexley syndicates. Illegal structure. Because during the review period, he had made a decision, and the decision had been surprisingly easy to make. It had been easy because he had spent 4 days watching himself choose restraint over force, and the choosing had worked, and the working had shown him something he had been circling for years without ever landing on directly. The criminal empire had been built for survival. In the beginning, that was literally true. Roman Vexley, at 25, had needed the structure the syndicate provided because the legitimate alternatives available to a young man with his background and his resources and his particular combination of intelligence and recklessness were not sufficient for the pace at which he intended to move. The syndicate had been the mechanism. At 41, the mechanism had outlived its purpose. He could afford to dismantle it. More than that, he was already living inside, the proof that he could operate without it. 4 days against Sterling Haverford, the most sophisticated financial predator Roman had encountered in his career, and Roman had not needed the syndicate's tools once. He had needed Warren Ellsworth and Philip Marsh's conscience and Decker's access to financial records and Claire's 8 years of patient construction. He had needed Claire. He started the dismantling quietly, over the same 47 days, the way he had built things methodically, in sequence, each piece addressed before moving to the next. Criminal partnerships terminated. Illegal operations restructured where they could be made legal, closed where they couldn't. Financial losses accepted. Significant losses. The kind of losses that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, and were now simply the cost of moving from one version of himself to the next. The people who had depended on the syndicate for their livelihoods were handled individually. Those whose work could be absorbed into legitimate operations were absorbed. Those who couldn't were given what Roman could give them, and told clearly that the structure they had known was no longer going to exist. Some of them understood, some of them didn't. A few of them were angry in ways that required management. Roman managed them, and when the managing was done, he moved to the next one. He did not hand the syndicate to another generation. He had considered it briefly. The arguments for an organized transfer were real, the alternative being a vacuum that other organizations would fill with varying degrees of disorder. But Roman had spent 4 decades learning something about what happened when you refuse to pass along the instruments of force, and the lesson had not been small. He chose the disorder. A sound like green wood splitting. Claire watched the dismantling from close range and said very little about it directly, because she understood Roman well enough to know that this was a process he needed to execute himself, and the most useful thing she could do was not narrate it. She made coffee. She was present. She asked practical questions when practical questions were useful, and was quiet when practical questions were not. She also spent the 47 days doing what she always did, which was running Hawthorne Dominion with the focused competence of a woman who had built it precisely, piece by piece, and intended to keep building. The Meridian entities that Hawthorne now controlled were placed under professional management, experienced executives recruited through a formal process that Claire ran herself, with Warren's oversight, with criteria that prioritized operational competence and documented clean histories and nothing else. Roman was offered no position within any of them. He had told Warren at the outset that he would accept no position obtained through his wife's ownership. Warren had noted the instruction and acted on it. Roman was not consulted on any of the management appointments. He found out who had been hired the same way he would have found out if he'd had no connection to Hawthorne at all through the business press, which reported the Meridian restructuring with the slightly bewildered thoroughness of a financial media that had spent 3 weeks trying to reconcile the known quantities of Roman Vexley's name with the unknown quantity of a billionaire wife, who had appeared in their coverage like a fact that had always been true and simply hadn't been reported yet. The coverage of Claire was intense for about 2 weeks. The architecture of Hawthorne's ownership, the 8-year construction of it, the acquisition of Sterling's empire. The regulatory battle it was, objectively, the kind of business story that financial journalists found irresistible. Claire gave 2 interviews. Both were conducted on her terms, in her offices, with questions reviewed in advance by Warren. Both covered Hawthorne's operational philosophy and its plans for the restructured Meridian entities and nothing else. She was precise and competent and utterly uninterested in performing any version of the drama for anyone who hadn't been inside it. The 3rd journalist who requested an interview was told, politely, no. The 4th through 15th were told the same. Philip Marsh cooperated fully with the forensic review and with the subsequent regulatory proceedings. A sound fry. His cooperation agreement provided him with a framework that acknowledged his role in the document tampering, while taking into account the circumstances of his recruitment and the specific nature of what he had been asked to do. He did not return to Roman's operation. Roman had not expected him to, and had not made any arrangement to the contrary. What happened to Philip Marsh after the proceedings was Philip Marsh's problem to solve, and Roman had enough of his own problems to solve without adding that one. Daniel Farrow's situation was more complicated, because 9 years of institutional knowledge and $400,000 in wire transfers from Sterling's intermediary put Farrow in a position that his cooperation agreement could mitigate but not eliminate. He spent the period of the proceedings under the management of his own attorney, whom Roman did not know and did not inquire about. The investigation of Faro's role in the conspiracy formed a separate track of the regulatory proceedings. Where that track ended was not Roman's determination to make. Roman had given Faro to the process. The process could have him. Callum Reyes, the intermediary, the financial consultant who had served as the operational connection between Sterling and Marsh and Faro, retained his own attorneys and declined to cooperate with the review board's investigation. This was his right. It was also, Warren noted with the dry precision of a man who had watched this calculation go wrong for many people in many proceedings. Choice splitting, a choice that would not serve him well once the documented financial chain between his accounts and Sterling's shells had been fully processed by the relevant regulatory bodies. Warren did not speculate about outcomes. He simply noted the choice and moved on. Sterling's cooperation agreement, negotiated by Patricia Venn over 3 days with Warren as the counterparty, was extensive. It covered the document tampering scheme in full. It covered the cultivation and payment of Faro. It covered the design and execution of the 9-month strategy to position Roman as the regulatory scapegoat. It covered the decision to name Claire in the original FinCEN complaint and the specific calculation behind that decision. Sterling did not go to prison. Roman had known he wouldn't and had never operated under the assumption that he would, because the relevant regulatory and legal frameworks governing financial misconduct of this particular kind were not designed to produce that outcome for men of Sterling's institutional standing and legal resources. What they were designed to produce was documented accountability, financial penalty, and the permanent removal of the person from the positions of authority through which the misconduct had been conducted. Sterling lost his board seats, his operating authority across every entity connected to the Meridian structure was permanently terminated. His financial penalty was significant a number that Warren described as meaningful and Sterling's attorneys described as disproportionate and the regulatory body described as appropriate. His name was attached, in the formal findings, to a detailed account of a 9-month conspiracy to commit financial fraud and regulatory obstruction. He retained his private wealth, most of it. Roman understood this and found to his moderate surprise that he did not care as much as he had expected to. The outcome he had wanted was not Sterling's personal destruction. He had told himself, in the early days of this, that what he wanted was Sterling's humiliation, the specific and satisfying reversal of a powerful man who had felt safe enough to perform cruelty in front of a dinner table and needed to be shown the cost of that safety. But by the time the formal findings arrived, 47 days later, Roman understood that what he had actually wanted was simpler and more durable than humiliation. He had wanted to be right. Not right as in vindicated by a panel's ruling, though that mattered, and he was not going to pretend it didn't. Right in the specific sense of having made the correct choices when the correct choices were the hardest ones. The walk out of the dining room. The word Monday in a hotel hallway, and trusting that whatever it carried and trusting what was something his marriage could hold. The 20 seconds at Faro's window, when he had stood inside the most powerful instinct of his adult life and chosen not to act on it. Right in that sense he was. The formal clearance document arrived at Warren's office on a Thursday morning, and Warren called Roman at 9:15 to read him the relevant section, which took approximately 45 seconds and used the specific language of regulatory findings, which is not a language built for drama. It was complete and precise and entirely adequate to the purpose. Roman thanked Warren, ended the call, and sat in the quiet of his home office for a while. Then he went to find Claire. She was in her office down the hall, the room that had spent 8 years, being the room Roman thought was for quiet investment management, and had actually been the room from which Hawthorne Dominion was built. He stood in the doorway. She was at her desk, with 3 documents open in front of her, reading something with the focused downward attention she brought to things that required her full engagement. She felt him looking. She looked up. "We're clear," he said. Claire set down her pen. She looked at him for a moment, and her expression moved through several things in rapid sequence: the relief, which was genuine and complete, the exhaustion of 47 days of sustained tension, finally having somewhere to go, something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same territory, and underneath all of it, something quieter and more private that Roman recognized as the specific emotion of a person who has spent a long time carrying something heavy and is now standing in the moment when they can finally put it down and look at what their hands are without it. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. He had expected something more from her. Some response proportional to 47 days and the months before them and the particular shape of the thing they had come through together. And what he got was one word delivered in the voice of a woman who was very simply and completely done. He found that he loved her for it. He walked to her desk and sat in the chair across from it, the chair that clients sat in when they were meeting with the founder of Hawthorne Dominion, which was a thing he was still integrating. The way you integrate a fact that is simultaneously entirely new and entirely consistent with everything you had always known about a person. He sat in the chair and looked at his wife. The syndicate, he said. The last operational piece. I signed off on it yesterday. Claire was quiet. It's done, he said. All of it. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her processing it, not the logistics of it. She had been aware of the logistics, but the fact of it. The irreversibility of it. The version of Roman Vexley that had existed for 20 years and did not exist in the same form anymore. How do you feel, she said. Roman thought about it honestly, because she had asked, and she deserved an honest answer rather than a performed one. Like I put down something very heavy, he said, and my arms still remember carrying it. And I don't know yet what I'm going to do with my arms. He paused. But I'm not sorry I put it down. Claire held his gaze. Good, she said. Then after a moment, Roman. The 8 years. I need to say something I haven't said correctly yet. You don't let me, she said. He waited. I told you I kept Hawthorne separate because I needed something that was mine. That's true. I told you secrecy became easier than confession. That's also true. She folded her hands on her desk. The gesture of a woman settling into the full honesty of something she had been approaching at an angle for too long. What I didn't tell you is that I was afraid. Roman was quiet. Not afraid you'd take it from me. Not afraid of what you'd do with it. Afraid of what it would mean. She paused. If I showed you Hawthorne and you looked at me differently, if the money changed the way you saw me, then I wouldn't know anymore whether the marriage we had was the marriage I thought it was. Whether you'd been loving me or the version of me that needed you. She met his eyes. I know that sounds... No, Roman said. I understand it. Was fear pretending to be strategy, she said. And I let it run for 8 years because the longer it ran, the more I'd convinced myself it was principled. Roman looked at his wife across the desk that had been a secret for 8 years. When I walked out of Sterling's dinner, he said, I didn't know you had $1 to your name beyond what I knew about. I walked out because you were my wife and someone had been cruel to you, and staying in the room was the wrong thing to do. He paused. I need you to know I was aware, in the car afterward, that I might have just cost us $40 million. I was aware of exactly what it cost, and I would have done it the same way. Claire's eyes were very bright. I know, she said. The money doesn't change how I see you, Roman said. You being a billionaire is the most Claire thing I have ever heard. It is completely consistent with every version of you I have ever known. The only thing it changes is that now I understand what you were doing in your office at 2 a.m. for 8 years, and I feel somewhat better about having left you alone when you asked me to. Something broke open in Claire's expression then. Not grief. Not relief. Laughter. The real kind, involuntary, arriving from somewhere that hadn't enough space to breathe for a long time. It lasted only a moment before it settled into something warmer and quieter, but it was real. And Roman felt something in his own chest respond to it with the specific warmth of a man watching the person he loves fully, completely themselves. She shook her head. You're insufferable, she said. You married me, he said. I'm aware of my mistakes. They looked at each other across the desk. Outside the window of Claire's office, Chicago was doing what it always did, moving, generating, existing with its usual magnificent indifference to the human dramas playing out above its streets. The lake was somewhere out there in the distance, flat and gray and permanent, the way it was always permanent, regardless of what happened near it. That evening they sat at the kitchen table. No Warren. No Decker, no Marcus waiting in the car. No attorneys, no financials, no documents requiring review. A sound splee. The kitchen table where they had eaten most of their dinners for 12 years, in the apartment that had been theirs, through the various transformations of who they were inside it. The ordinary scratch surface of it. The chairs that were slightly mismatched because they'd replaced one of them 3 years ago and never gotten around to replacing the others. Roman made pasta. He was not a sophisticated cook. His range was narrow and reliable, built on the same 3 or 4 things he had learned to make during the years when they couldn't afford not to cook at home. The pasta was fine. It was not elegant. It was the pasta of a man who cooks because the meal needs to happen, rather than because the cooking is pleasurable. Claire ate 2 full servings, which told him more about the state of her body after 47 days of sustained stress than anything she could have said directly. After dinner, Roman reached into his wallet. He had carried the note there for 12 years. It had been folded and refolded enough times that the creases were permanent. The paper softened at the edges into something that felt more like cloth than paper. He unfolded it carefully, the way you handle something old and important, and placed it on the table between them. Claire looked at it. She recognized her green wood splitting. She recognized her own handwriting younger, slightly more angular than it was now, written in the particular pen she'd used during those years, because she'd bought a 12-pack at the dollar store and had been working through it. You'll build something worth keeping. She looked at the note for a long time. I wrote that when, she said. The night the freight company was 90 days from closing, Roman said. You pushed the envelope with your savings across the table, and then you went to bed and you left that on top of my paperwork. He looked at the note. I found it in the morning. I put it in my wallet because I needed it there. Claire's finger touched the edge of the note, gently, the way you touch something you'd forgotten you'd made. I don't remember writing it, she said. I know, I never told you. She looked up at him. I spent a long time thinking the important word was build, Roman said. I thought it was about construction, about the empire, the reputation, the all of it, the accumulation. He paused. It took me until Friday night in a parking garage, sitting in the back of my car, thinking about what I'd just done to understand what the note was actually about. What's it about? Claire said quietly. Keeping, Roman said. You wrote build, but you meant keep. The whole 12 years you were never telling me to build more. You were telling me to figure out what was worth holding on to. He looked at her. I built a lot of things. Money, influence, an organization capable of frightening a city. I built all of it, and then I stood in a parking garage and understood that I'd been carrying this note for 12 years, because it was the closest thing I had to a fixed point. He paused. You were the fixed point. You were always the fixed point. Claire looked at the note on the table between them. The kitchen was quiet, the particular Thursday evening quiet of an apartment that had been through a great deal recently, and was resting. I should have told you about Hawthorne, she said. Yes. I know that's not enough. It's enough for tonight, he said. She looked at him. Roman, what do you do now? The syndicate is gone. You're not in the Meridian operations. I'm figuring it out, he said. That doesn't frighten you? He thought about it. The honest answer was that it did a little, the way any large empty space frightens a person who has spent their adult life filling space as fast as it appeared. A sound like green wood splitting, but underneath the low-grade fear was something else, something he hadn't enough room to feel while the syndicate was running and the alliance was pending, and Sterling was building his 9-month trap. Something that felt cautiously and without certainty, like the beginnings of something he hadn't built yet and didn't know the shape of. A little, he said. But I've been frightened before. Claire smiled, just slightly. The smile of a woman who had watched a man she loved be frightened before and knew what he did with it. Then, Roman's expression shifted. He looked at her with the specific expression he got when something had been sitting at the edge of his mind and had just moved to the front. How much? He said. What? Hawthorne. Total valuation, current fiscal year. He held her gaze. How much? Claire looked at him for a moment. No, she said. Claire. No. I'm your husband. I'm aware of who you are. I have a right to. No rights to Hawthorne's financials, she said with complete pleasantness. You have declined every position connected to any entity I control, which I respect entirely, and which also means you are a private citizen with no standing to request a financial disclosure. Roman stared at her. 20 million, he said. No. 50, no, 100 million. Claire picked up her wine glass. Claire, I'm thinking about whether I want more pasta. You're not thinking about pasta, Roman. How far off am I? She looked at him over the rim of her glass. Her expression had the quality of a woman enjoying something she was not going to share. Very, she said. Roman leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling of his kitchen, the ordinary ceiling of an ordinary kitchen in an apartment that belonged unto a woman who controlled a private conglomerate of a scale he was apparently not yet capable of accurately estimating. I need a number, he said. You don't need a number. I want one. That's different, Claire said, and still no. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the complete serenity of a woman who had built something for 8 years in the quiet of a home office, while the man she married believed she was managing modest portfolios, and had discovered, through the particular crucible of the last 2 weeks, that the thing she had built was not only real but sufficient, and that the man across the table from her was still the man she had pushed an envelope toward at 2 in the morning when he needed it most, and that these two facts coexisted without contradiction and without end. The dishes, she said. Roman glanced at the sink. Those can wait. It's your night. It's always my night. It's a system, Claire said. The system works. Roman looked at the sink, then at his wife, then at the note on the table between them, 12 years of folded paper, the softest edges, the handwriting of a younger woman who had looked at a man sitting in the ruins of something he'd built and seen, with complete and unpretentious certainty, what he was going to do next. He picked up the note, folded it, put it back in his wallet. Then he stood up and went to the sink and started running the water. Behind him, Claire sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and looked at the space he'd just moved through, and outside the windows, Chicago kept going with its permanent indifferent energy. A sound like green wood splitting, and somewhere in the city the structures Roman had spent 20 years building were in the process of becoming other things. And the structures Claire had spent 8 years building were in the process of becoming known. And the two of them were in a kitchen on a Thursday night, with pasta dishes in the sink, and 12 years of marriage between them, and whatever came next beginning, somewhere in the quiet that followed the end of a very long storm. Sterling was finished. Roman was clear. The syndicate was gone. The secret was gone. What remained was the thing that had always been there. A sound like green wood splitting before the money and the empire and the reputation and the 9 months of someone else's careful malice, the two people who had sat at a kitchen table when everything was failing and one of them had pushed an envelope across the surface and the other had picked it up. The water ran. Roman washed the dishes. Claire sat with her wine and the quiet and did not tell him the number, and the apartment held them both in the ordinary, irreplaceable way that home holds the people who have chosen to keep coming back to it. That was enough. That had always been enough. It had taken a dinner, a betrayal, 9 months of someone else's architecture, 47 days of dismantling it, and one very long look at what was actually worth keeping to understand that completely. But they were here, and the door behind them, for the first time in a very long time, had nothing dangerous waiting on the other side of it.